Started. Here we go. Let's do a little bit of review from
I
last.
actually do have a quick
Yeah,
question. I'm
go for it.
sorry.
Sure, go for it.
Um, the background check information, where can I find that? How to set that up?
Who can help her out with that question? I like that question. Who knows? Think back to the very first day, your very first assignment that we assigned you in class marker. What was it? What was your
Okay.
very first assignment? What resource did you use to finish your very first assignment? It's a very important part of your process. There you go, Sheena. She says relink, or I think that's what she was trying to say. Relink. It's the relink booklet. You see what Neil's showing on his screen now?
Oh,
Maybe a
excellent,
link to it.
excellent.
Now,
Okay. Yeah.
that has everything you need to know about the application process, the licensing process, which includes taking this course, background check process. It's got the link in there for you to submit that. Remember, you can't submit your application until you're done. You can start it, you can create an account with the real estate commission, but you can't finish it. It's going to ask you for things that you can't have until you finish the course. So,
Okay.
but there's the information right there on
All
Neil's,
right.
and that's it.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, don't apologize. That was a good reminder to
Yeah.
everyone, because that was so long ago that we talked about the relink booklet and why we use that, but that's going to have everything you need to know in there.
Okay.
Thanks for
Thank
that
you.
question, Christy. You bet.
Yeah, it gets it. We get that every time. It's just a lot of information between the textbook and the comment section and the license law and the commission rules and this one. So very normal, very natural question. And now's a great time to get really familiar with this again, refamiliar with it, because it does, as he said, spell out the exact journey process from here to the PSI. So you can see the various ways to register for that. One big change, because this is actually a new version of the Relink as of this year, 23. The previous version was from 21. And the big change is you cannot take it remotely. You've got to go there. They changed to remote possibility back when that thing which shall not be named was taking place, but now you got to go there. Good news is there's lots of PSI locations. So no matter where you are, even if you happen to be maybe on vacation, if there was a PSI location near that spot, you could just coordinate it to take place there. So it spells all of that out quite explicitly. The other thing, let's see, he's going to go more into detail with the email next week, but FYI, I get this question a lot. The passing score required is a 75 or more. The retake score is a 60 or more, unless I'm mistaken. He will jump in here, I'm sure, and correct me, but
Correct.
We're good. Thank you. I was hoping you were still there.
Yep.
And that's how that's going to work. Just to clarify, the 31st, right? Yep. Is the original final exam night. It will be done via class marker. So he will release it on class marker for you on that night. You won't see that ahead of time, obviously. And I will be here. Everybody will be here and quiet, and you will be instructed. And basically you have to be on camera the whole time. And I'll be basically a proctor while you're sitting there taking your exam via class marker. And let's see. So the big deal about missing, if you were to have to miss that 31st exam, that would have to be a special case. And here's the problem. If you bump it to the next week and take it on the retake night, and then you get a below 75 but above 60, you don't have any other choice. You're done. You'd have to retake the entire course. Otherwise, on the 31st, if you get 60 or better, you could just sit for the exam on the following week again, get a second chance at the exam. So that's kind of how that works for the most part. He'll go much more into detail about the class marker and what's expected in the calculator and all that fun stuff, and verifying that you're alone in the room and have scratch paper and nothing that you could cheat with and all the stuff that you have to do. So look out for that one. It's a pretty detailed email that you'll be getting. So that'll get us to next week. I like that background. That's cool. Let's check back in with our valuation chapter and do a little bit of review there, and then we'll just kind of build from there. And we could probably review closing procedures a little bit later this evening just to make sure you're on top of that too. Got a Kahoot for that. But if you recall, we had some important terms to know. The difference between market value and market price. And the whole concept of this value word keeps being brought up even in post-licensing, even in CE, because we are not allowed as brokers to call this thing that we do with our CMAs or our BPOs a valuation. We can't use the word value. We're not even supposed to use the word worth. They don't like the word worth or value as to what we create or come up with. We don't create it. We just observe it and document it and share with the client, here's what similar properties have sold for, and therefore what your probable sales price is would be this. And ideally that should be in a range, right? That just helps you. It helps you cover your bases when they maybe let down their end of the bargain. A lot of times the client will say, yes, I'm going to have it perfect, ready to go. I'm going to do this and this and this, and your entire list of suggestions that you're giving me for cleaning and staging and decluttering, and they may or may not get busy and maybe drop the ball a little bit. And if you've promised them a certain number on the dot, they're not going to remember that they didn't do what they were promising to do. They're going to remember that you quoted them a number and didn't fulfill it. So it's really good to have that range of probable sales price. So market value is basically the estimated price the appraiser thinks it's going to sell for, what a buyer will pay and what a seller would accept, based on evidence, based on past history of what buyers have recorded to have been willing to pay for. Right? What are those things called that the appraiser and we as well look at to gauge how much a property might sell for? What are the names of those items we're looking for? There you go. Corey says comps, comparable sales. Here's the other thing, a testable question that I don't think we've gotten to in the slides just yet, but let's see if you can tell me, what are the best kind of comps to use for coming up with that probable sales price? I'll give you choices. Ones that have already sold, ones that are currently for sale, or ones that are under contract. Which one is the best one to predict future value? Yeah, those sold ones. And as you remember from the MLS, I've shown that to you in real time a couple of times and a couple of slides about it. We have all the data through the MLS. We have the actives, the under contracts that are still able to be shown, the ones that are no longer able to be shown, the withdrawn listings, the expired listings, the temporarily off the market listings, the solds, and out of all of those, it's all useful information. But we can't very well use one that is not sold as proof of what a buyer's been willing to pay. The active ones, what's wrong with using an active listing that hasn't sold yet? What's the problem with using that to base what a property might be worth? What's the hang up there? Yeah, there you go. The sale might not go through. I like to call the list price a wish price, right? Because they might very well just be hoping and wishing that that's what they get. They might not even be basing that list price on anything real. It might just be one of those cases that's pretty darn near willful misrepresentation or exactly that, where the agent has said, what do you want to sell it for? Because I'll tell you anything to get this listing. Some of that they say, some of that they think. So we don't know if that's a case at any given listing. So it's up to us, if we're working for that buyer, to verify that the house that they like is even priced remotely within reason. So that list price isn't going to work. It isn't going to do us any good, because all we know with that is what the seller would be willing to take, but we don't even know the lowest they might be willing to take. That list price is just what they want to throw it on the market for. So actives won't help us in determining probable sales price, although they are good to look at as a side set of data. It's nice to know what the competition is for increasing our chances of getting showings. So it's not that we don't look at actives, it's that the solds are the best ones for determining the actual value that buyers have been willing to pay for properties. And then under contract, what about those? They actually have a contract in on them. There's a contract that exists with those under contract listings. And so why wouldn't we be able to use those for our market analysis or for an appraisal? There it is. It could fall through. Also, it's confidential. Whose permission would we even need in order to use the under contract price if we happen to know it? We couldn't just use it and share it with anybody. We would need someone's permission, even if it were something that we were going to use. And it's not the seller's. It's the one who made that highest offer. Remember that part? So it kind of applies here again. It's not the seller's permission that we need in that case. We can't disclose what an under contract is under contract for without the person who is the winner and who actually is willing to pay something. But set all that aside. It's just the part about it may not even close for that. It might even be under contract for $315, but by the time the closing happens, they drop the price to $300 to allow for repairs that the seller didn't want to do, so they drop the price in lieu of. So it doesn't do us any good either, just like the actives. It is kind of useful to look at the under contracts and see that, oh, well, this asking price didn't scare someone away. Someone was willing to make an offer of some sort. We just don't know what that offer ended up being and the contract ended up being for until it closes. Sometimes you see an under contract and it looks exactly perfect match with what the one you're trying to list, the subject property, looks like, and you're hoping maybe it'll close by the time that we get a contract so that the appraiser for this one can use it as a comp because it would be such a good comp. But it may or may not close in time. So the best possible one is the sold property. We talked about market price, and that is actually what the thing sold for. That's the one, that's why we use sold properties. And then, of course, cost. That's the one that's really fun for conversations with sellers. That seller's really proud of their place. They probably think, just off the top of their head, without any proof otherwise yet, until you share it with them, that it's worth more than it truly is. They don't know what's out there oftentimes, and it's for us to help them understand it. I've even heard of some agents that are struggling so much with a seller just not grasping it that they just schedule a preview appointment of a couple of houses in the neighborhood to actually show it to that seller, help them understand, oh, wow, see in person that theirs is far inferior to the ones that are out there for sale. So cost is a source of pretty fun conversations where you've got to just really explain and help them understand. I know you put a bunch of time and money in this, and the more sweat equity they put in it, probably the more value they think it's worth. But here's what similar properties are selling for. And that's when I like to actually just show it. I try to defer the bad news to letting them realize it on their own and show them the pictures, show them the listings themselves, and help them understand and come to the conclusion themselves. 3 ways to report valuation. We talked about what the appraiser does is the appraisal. That one's pretty easy to remember. What the broker does are the other two. Tell me a difference between CMA and BPO. What's the difference there? Might be for whom do we do them? Who do we do a CMA for versus a BPO? Yeah, you guys are getting it. Paid versus unpaid. The CMA is typically not paid for. It's just part of that category of listing activities that we're doing for that seller. And that seller is our client. The BPO we would do for a customer. You got it. CMA is typically unpaid and fiduciary. Unpaid in that you don't pay for the actual item. The BPO you do. Somebody would pay you to do a broker price opinion because they just want to know your opinion as a broker as to what it probably would sell for. You notice it's not a BVO, broker's value opinion, because we can't use that word as brokers. The thing that we give them You better not use value or worth. The method of all three of these is quite similar. The appraisal might involve both the comparative market analysis method, the comparable sales method, the and also the cost approach, and maybe even the income approach. Our opinion, our CMA or BPO is going to be probably just one of those typically, and it's going to depend on the type of property we're dealing with. And quite often in just a straight up sale, unless it's an investment property, what you're going to deal with is picking comparables that match with that subject the closest you possibly can find. Because the fewer adjustments you make, the more of an accurate number it's going to be. When can you do a BPO? When is it okay to do one? We know that provisional brokers can't do either BPOs or CMAs for money, whichever one you want to call it. If you're doing it for money, it's not allowed for provisional to do that. So you have to be non-provisional, full broker. But even a full broker doing a BPO for money cannot do it for what situations? Let's say it's a bank. There you go. We can do one for the bank. Thank you, Deborah. But not if it's for the purpose of originating a loan or a mortgage, right? Also, if the law doesn't allow them to use a BPO, they require them to use an appraisal. If we find that out, that they're asking us to do it, and we know that it's supposed to be an appraisal, we'd have to turn them down. So there we go. Cannot do a BPO if it's for an origination of a loan or refinancing of a mortgage, and anytime an appraisal is specifically required by law. Talked about some value elements, and the elements of value are four, known and remembered with the acronym DUST. We've got desirability, utility, scarcity, and transferability. We're seeing a lot of scarcity right now. Still a lot of scarcity among listings that are available, so it's quite competitive to get listings. Transferability affects value. If it's a property that's just in this big mess, either in condition or with their title work, or its ease of transferability, all of that could affect valuation and what the buyer wants to do with it. They'll pay more if it suits their needs of what they need to use it for, typically. Desirability and financial ability also play into it. That's probably the most obvious one. We talked about this principle of highest and best use. And there we go. And that's something the appraiser is actually going to address in their report, in their opinion, their appraiser's opinion. The appraisal is going to say it's being used to its highest and best use. After looking at the market and the local market and what they're using it for compared to everything else, I think it is being used to its high, or I don't think it is. And they'll give a little more explanation about that. The three approaches to value we talked about. Sales comparison method, that's for land and single family. What's the other one? What's another of the three approaches of valuation? Cost approach. What kind of structure do we use for that? What kind of property do we use a cost approach for? Or does the appraiser use the cost approach for in determining valuation? Yeah. Structures, properties that aren't just sold all the time. There's no neighborhood of old churches or schools or government buildings. So you got to work from a different angle. Instead of looking for comparables, you would need to see what does it cost to build this from scratch. But it's not new. It's 40 years old. So how can we adjust it for the age and the inferior condition? And that's called depreciation. So we would come up with a depreciation amount from that new construction amount. Here's a little side note that we'll learn more about tonight. You cannot depreciate the land value in that cost approach. Does land depreciate? No, it's always dirt, right? So land does not depreciate. We would not include that in the depreciation amount. We would only include the cost of the improvements and depreciate that. We'll get more into that. What about the income approach? What are we using for that? What kind of properties will we use the income approach for? Yeah, there you go. Rental properties, income properties. You might even see this referred to as the income capitalization approach. For income producing properties. We're going to see an equation later tonight. I gave you a little glimpse last night. The given acronym equation shows how we get to this thing called the net operating income, and all of that falls under this income approach. If you're an investor or interested in being one, this is the kind of thing you're going to be thinking about properties. This is the lens through which you're going to be looking at potential investment properties. You're not so worried about how pretty they are and what the one down the street sold for. You're more interested in what the financial statements look like. What are the operating expenses to keep this thing running? What's the potential rent that you could collect? How long ago was the rent raised? As a new owner, could you raise the rent right off the bat? And what kind of vacancy rate is there? And what could you do to adjust that to sort of fine tune it and get it into an ideal number? And we talked about how that vacancy rate probably is not ideal at 100%. You may not want all 100 units or 200 units occupied, because that might mean you're not asking enough in rent or getting enough in rent. If you got more in rent from fewer people, you'd probably make more money, which is a very real question that investors are looking at. And they tend to know what's a good prime, kind of a great spot to be in terms of vacancy. So an appraiser might very well use all three of these methods and mention them in their report. If it's clearly not an income property, they wouldn't maybe use that, but they would mention the sales comparison and the cost approach. And then it's just up to them to determine which way is the property being used, and that's the valuation that we lean more toward, or that they put more weight on. The appraiser never takes an average of those three approaches. They pick them one, and give more weight to the one that's the closest fit. And speaking of that closest fit, that's what comparables are all about. Sales comparison method. We're looking for things. I think some of you mentioned stuff a little earlier in location, but first and foremost, recency, the date. How long ago did this thing close? If it closed a year ago, odds are an appraiser's not going to use it. It needs to be much more recent than that. Sometimes properties are so unique that you're really struggling to find comparables. I sold one that was a log home on 27 acres with a bunch of pastures and a bunch of exterior buildings and barns and shops and sheds, and had a little stream running through it, and it had an off-the-grid cabin they hand-built, 2-story hunting cabin that his 63-year-old man and his wife hauled the logs up there with their tractor and trailer and notched them out and built that thing by hand. That's what people of that generation do for fun. They don't go on vacations. They do more work. And this thing had its own outhouse with a septic tank that they had dug, and had a water tank off the side for the kitchen. How do you put a value on that? There's no neighborhood of those anywhere. So I had to do some cutting and pasting when they wanted to list with me, and I had to price land alone. I had to price cabins, which was hard because there's just not even a bunch of those around. So then I'm looking at newer houses of the same square feet that might kind of match up. And the whole time I'm thinking, what would an appraiser do? Right? What are they going to look at it? And when I was done, they had been on the market, in fact, for like a year and a half already. And it was the dad of my childhood friend, he and his wife, who had this property, tried with 3 different agents for a year and a half. The first agent came in there and basically said, "What do you want to sell it for?" And gave them no data, no research, no CMA. And they said, well, we were thinking of all the sweat equity we've put in it and all this work and what it is, we made it great, 800,000. And she said, okay. And they went from there, no showings for like a year. They relisted with someone else. They dropped it to 750. They dropped it to 700, and they dropped it to 650 by the time I came along. And his son said, why don't you call Neil? You'll at least get the truth. He'll at least level with you. And I went up there and took a look. It's in North Wilkesboro. And the math that I did, the CMA that I could come up with showed $400,000. Now, how hard was it? How tense of a conversation do you think it was to explain to these couple of mountain folks that loved me, knew me well enough to be comfortable cussing me out in their frustration? My ears bled a little bit. I cried a little on the way home, but it's okay. I knew it was going to be the way it was. I brought my wife with me because it was like a Friday night. They wanted to meet. And she is not confrontational. And on the way home, she said, I don't want to come back because it was like, what? The GD and the blah, 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 and the F, and you're crazy. At the end of the day, they listed with me. And they said, what about 500? We're at 650 now. Can we try 500? And I told them the 400, and I said, we can try it. We're in a market, but here's the proof. Here's the CMA. And long as you promise that we will adjust if we're not getting any traction. And guess what we ended up selling for about 90, 120 days later? Thankfully, somebody called me off the very large yard sign that I had made, like a 4x8 piece of plywood sign, because it was a relatively busy road and giant letters and a website of the address that I bought to make it super easy to look it up. So I was a dual agent. I got to be a dual agent, which added another element of stress, but that also let me be a little more negotiable with my commission. And that was the only way I pulled this thing together, because it basically gave up half of what I would normally charge for various reasons. Hey, we have a buyer willing to buy this unicorn property, and it wasn't quite what the seller wanted, but the buyer said, I will pay $400,000. That was not with me telling them what I thought. That's just the buyer coming up with a number, and he wouldn't budge past it. So we basically sold it for pretty much right around there. And because I was able to wheel and deal a little bit on my side, it worked for everybody. And we pulled it together. But they had spent a year and a half at double the value. And I wish I could say it's unusual, but I think there's a lot of properties out there that are priced poorly. So you just don't know, right? In this market, this was probably 10 years ago, but in a market like this, maybe there would be some competition that would have driven that price up a little bit. But the creation of that CMA was tough. Having to come up with, okay, how much it was almost a combination of a market analysis. I mean, the sales comparison method and the cost approach, because I'm thinking, okay, here's what a house on 1 acre sells for. Now let's add in 26 more acres at however much those cost or sell for. Now let's add in approximate value of a nice concrete floor barn and then a bunch of little old sheds and stuff. And now let's add in something for that crazy off-the-grid cabin they hand-built. You better believe they wanted to put a bunch of premium price on that thing, because that was just hard work every weekend for who knows how long. So sometimes that's what you have to do. We're also looking for things that sell in an open, non-distressed situation. If the subject property in question was not a distressed sale, then you can't use distressed sales as a comparable. It needs to be arm's length. It needs to be as well. Can't be a family to family kind of sale, because that's probably not selling for an accurate sales price that a stranger might be willing to sell the house to another stranger for. Picking those comps, we're looking for things that have closed recently. We're looking for things that are geographically close. After that, we're looking for 1 story versus 2 story. Very testable to think about this 1 story versus 2 story scenario. And then after that, we're probably talking size and types of siding, brick versus vinyl. amenities, the upgrade level, the condition level, how's the kitchen and bathroom. We kind of walked through a little bit of that last night. I showed you kind of my train of thought and what I wanted to look at. I like to read the remarks and see if any new stuff they put in it, because they will brag about it if they put new stuff. If they don't list that in the remarks, that probably doesn't have any to brag about or talk about. And then it's pictures. Let's see how it holds up. Although those can be challenging too, because as of yet, and I don't foresee it in the foreseeable future, there's no requirement of what pictures to put in the MLS. As a buyer agent, I wish there was. As a listing agent, I'm glad there's not. But as a buyer agent, it'd be nice if they said you have to stand at every corner and take a picture and not squat or try to block the high tension power line behind the tree strategically. You certainly can't remove it in post editing. That's not allowed. And if you do show how it could look with furniture in it, virtual staging, you have to disclose that that's what it is. And the level we're at with that virtual staging, it's kind of not, nobody's falling for it usually, but you do have to disclose what you're looking at, but you don't have to take certain picture angles. And that brings us to adjustments. So let's kind of hunker down in this sales comparison method and think about how we're going to take a recently sold property and what it's sold for and adjust that sales price in a way that will match up with the subject property the best. What we're looking for is, we know that comparable sale. We've got our subject. We've got our comparable, and we're ultimately going to have at least 3, maybe even 4. But we know that the subject property has 2,400 square feet and 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms and a 2-car garage. We also know that it is brick, full brick, on 1 acre. And then that comparable sold at some point, hopefully within the last month, and it sold for $450,000. And it was 2,200 square feet. Also 3 bedrooms, but it had 3 bathrooms, and it had a 1-car garage, and it had vinyl instead of brick, and it was on 1/2 of an acre. So how do we adjust that 450 that it sold for to come to the conclusion of, well, if this comparable had 2,400 square feet instead of 22, and 2 bathrooms instead of 3, and 2-car garage instead of 1, and brick instead of vinyl, and 1 acre instead of a 1/2 acre, if we adjusted all of those things with dollars to account for each one of those things, what would it have sold for then? That's all we're doing. That's what an appraiser's doing. That's what we're doing. How do we adjust that 450? We're going to add and subtract from it for each of these various things. So one of the things we're going to do is, through our research, we're going to find out that houses like this one are selling for $105 per square foot. If they're selling for $105 per square foot, that's going to be something we discover through our experience and analysis of this research. We're going to look at similar properties and just come up with a number based on various things. So how many square feet different are these 2 properties? We've got 200 square feet of difference. And at $105 a square foot, as an adjustment number, how much do we need to change that price by? 200 times the 105, that's a $21,000 adjustment. But we've got a 2,400 foot subject. We've got a 2,200 foot comparable. The comparable is smaller. So here's what you're going to need to do when you're working through this in the class, on the test. hold out your hands, even if you have to do this physically, and say, okay, subject is here. This is subject property at 2,400. Is that more or less than the comparable? Comparable's down here, subject is up here. What do we need to do to this comparable to get it up to the level of the subject? Do we need to add dollars or subtract dollars? If we're moving from down to up, we're adding dollars, right? Because that comparable is less than, so we need to add to whatever it sold for. We're going to add that $21,000 to this 450. And so it's going to look like that, plus 21,000. So as we go down through it and make the rest of the adjustments, we're going to say 450 plus 21,000. What about this bathroom situation? Now we've got a subject with 2 bathrooms and I forgot which I had as my subject. Let's say that's the subject, and a comparable with 3. So we need to pull that comparable down to the level of the subject. We're going to be subtracting something for the value of a bathroom. And so based on your research as to what a bathroom is worth, you might discover that a bathroom is worth $7,000. Now, keep in mind, what are we talking about, $7,000? Is that the cost it is to build a bathroom? No. It's an adjustable amount, an adjusted value. So what's the difference in a resale market of a 3-bathroom versus 2-bathroom? That's what this number is. It's not the cost to build it. It's just the adjustment value. And the same for the square footage. The 105 is not what it costs to build that property. It's just a good number that acts as an adjustment ratio between the subject and the comparable. In fact, what I'll do in real life is look at a couple of those comparables, do some division and say, oh, it sold for this divided by the square feet, and there is like a $200 a square foot number. And then I'll take a fraction of that, maybe a third of it, maybe a half of it. In this kind of market, more like a half or 2/3 of it, maybe 50-60% of that full sale price divided by square footage. On the test, they're not going to make you go as deep as all that. You'll have to get more into that in the real wild, like when you're actually learning this from your broker in charge. But for the test, they will give you these adjustment numbers probably that you'll just work with. You don't have to get some whole big notebook full of comparables and come and deduce these numbers for yourself to pass this class. So if a bathroom adjustment value is 7,000 and we have 1 bathroom difference between the two, and we know we need to subtract, then we're going to subtract 7,000 from what that comparable sold for. Why don't we subtract from what the subject is worth? Why are we subtracting and adding from the comparable price and not the subject price? What is it about that subject that keeps us from being able to add or subtract to it? It's kind of staring you in the face, so if you think about it. Do we know what that subject is going to sell for in the future? We have no idea. It's a question mark. And when you add or subtract from a question mark, you still get a question mark. It doesn't do you much good. So here's a very testable thing that you might run into. What do you adjust? Always adjust the comparable sale price. Never adjust the subject. Write this one down. Never adjust the subject. Always adjust the comparable, because that's the only one that you know for sure what it sold for. You can't adjust the subject. That's what you're trying to figure out. You don't know the answer yet. So far we're adding 21,000 for square footage difference. We're subtracting 7,000 for the bathroom difference. Now we've got another difference in the garage. And from your research, you've determined that a garage is worth $11,000. The adjustment value for a garage, a difference between a 1-car and a 2-car. Well, if that comparable only has a 1-car garage and the subject has 2, we need to add to what the comparable sold for. So there's another plus. And so that's going to be a plus 11,000 for the garage. And we're not done. We have 2 more to go. We've got brick versus vinyl. In your experience, in your research, by the way, It's another reason that I suggest meeting the appraiser at the house, because I like to chat with them when they're done. I don't want to get in their way. But also, hopefully, if I'm nice enough, they will invite me to call them if I have questions. And maybe later, a month later, I'm trying to do a CMA. And I'm trying to figure out what's brick versus vinyl worth in a certain neighborhood. So I've heard numbers all over the place. I've heard things like $8,000 per side. How many sides in a house? Let's say 4. 4 sides of brick, $8,000 a piece, $32,000 from a full vinyl house to a full brick house. Let's go with that. Let's just say $32,000 for the difference between a brick house and a vinyl house. Now, the vinyl subject and the vinyl comparable and the brick subject, we need to do what again? We're increasing it to the level of the subject, so that's another addition. It's inferior. And when the comparable is inferior to the subject, we need to add. So there's that 32,000. And then finally, acres. We might find out what the dollars per acre is, or the test might tell you 1 acre is worth this and a half acre is worth that. Let's just go with that. Let's say a half acre is worth $15,000. That comparable is smaller than the subject. Yet again, we need to add to what the comparable sold for by 1/2 acres dollars worth. And in this case, that's 15,000. We have a lot of numbers now. Let's take our 450 and let's add 21,000 to it. Then we're going to subtract 7,000 from that. Then we're going to add 11,000 to that. Then we're going to add 32,000 to that. Then we're going to add 15,000 to that. So everything else being the same, just adjusting for this little handful of differences, that comp should have sold theoretically for $522 based on those adjustments. And that's pretty darn real world example as to pluses and minuses. On the appraisal report, you'll see that the appraiser did this very thing, like page 2 or 3 or 4 or something like that. You'll see where they plussed and minused all the various differences that they felt were important. What other things might be on this list of differences between the subject and the comparable? What else might matter in real life? Yeah, maybe one's far more landscaped. Maybe extra things like deck, curb appeal, okay, condition. Yeah. Datedness. Most recently for me, it was a good bit of wood rot from the siding. So probably an adjustment for needing to make those repairs. Roof. Yeah, there you go. Roof condition, flooring, kitchens and baths. All that's huge because people care about that stuff. And then especially the roof and some of those things like that based on the type of loan the buyer's getting. Because if it's an FHA loan, that FHA appraiser is going to also mention the roof age, windows that are broken, big holes in the wall, the presence of a range in the kitchen, and paint peeling down to the wood. All of those things factor in and need to be corrected. So what if the seller doesn't want to do any of that work? First of all, are they required to? That FHA appraiser mentions all of these things on the report. Does that mean the seller has to do it? What could the seller say? Hey, the FHA won't give me the loan. Lender won't give me the loan, won't give me the FHA loan because they require all these things. You better do it so I can buy this house. Seller will say, next. I'm sorry for you. I will gladly keep your due diligence money because that is my right. And now you should have thought of all of this before you made an offer on a fixer-upper. And really the agent should have thought about that too. as an agent, we need to have enough reasonable skill and care to recognize when our FHA buyer is overshooting the mark. They might want to buy a fixer-upper, but they can't get financing to handle a fixer-upper unless it's a certain kind. Don't have to go that far, but there is an FHA version of a loan called a 203K that does allow you to borrow the extra that you need in order to do the work, but that's a whole nother animal. But in this case, the seller's going to say, I'm not doing any of that. Do you know what market we're in right now? Sorry, not sorry. I'll just put it back on the market, collect another due diligence fee. Now, it would be smart and conscientious for that listing agent to explain to the seller how this stuff works and say, therefore, seller, your time is important. Maybe we just don't even allow any offers or consider any offers from FHA buyers because we know the roof is 25 years old and there's no way it'll pass an appraisal. And while it might be nice for you to collect 2 due diligence monies, the one from the FHA person that had to walk and then the next one, you probably want to just move on with life, correct? So that's a real world thing, real world conversation to have. So, superior versus inferior. That's the big question about these comparables, about these adjustments we're making. Is this property superior or inferior, the subject versus the comparable? And so for each of those types of items that we talked about, that's what you're thinking about. So you'll know whether to add or subtract the adjusted amount for that given item. Let's see. Would the agent have to disclose the roof to other FHA buyers? Oh, that's a good point. So here's a couple of things that come about with this whole process. We've had it inspected. We've had it appraised. The deal fell through, and it's an FHA transaction. Number one, you're the listing agent, and now you've been given an inspection report that shows more material facts. Are you required to disclose these newly discovered material facts? Yes. And as a buyer agent, I take great pleasure, obscene pleasure in sending that inspection report over to that listing agent, because I'm thinking, if you don't take this and move on and negotiate these repairs and we keep this deal together, then you're going to have to disclose stuff if this thing falls apart, because now you can't deny that you know about it. So that's one thing. Secondly, there's a certain nuance about FHA appraisals. Once a property has had an FHA appraisal done on it, and you will actually see this in the contract if you read far enough, because it was an FHA appraisal, it sticks to the property for 4 months. So here's our situation. We had an FHA buyer. The roof was old. They required the roof to be replaced. The seller said, no, thanks. You can go now. The seller puts it back on the market, open and available to more FHA buyers. The next buyer comes along using FHA financing. They're going to have to use the same appraisal as long as it's within 4 months of that first one. Probably the smart play is to say, okay, we're putting it back on the market. Let's erase the part about FHA buyers from here forward. We don't want and we don't like that appraisal that we got. You're not willing to fix the roof to correct the problem. Therefore, let's just not get any offers from any other FHA buyers. Conventional and cash only be the sort of thing you might pursue. So, would an agent have to disclose the roof to other FHA buyers? If you know something new that you didn't know before, it's a material fact, yeah, you would. Now, I mean, there's always gray kind of nuance. What are we saying about the roof? Does it actively leak? Then yes, for sure. Is it just old and it's this one appraiser or one inspector's opinion that it needs to be replaced? And that's kind of where it gets a little weird and awkward. Like, the whole overarching theme of the inspection report is we're looking for items that are in need of immediate repair. We're not looking for what could happen, woulda, coulda, shoulda. A sale I just recently had has a 31-year-old heating and air system. I mean, they don't last that long these days. this one's still cranking. Does it need to be replaced? Yeah. I don't want to go through a winter or a summer, the hottest of the hot, the coldest of the cold, just hoping that it's not going to blow up one day and be completely cold and freezing or completely hot. But it's still cranking. That's right. They make them with, what is it, pre-designed obsolescence, built-in obsolescence. So yeah, I need to find out who made that thing and just buy that one. But it probably doesn't matter. It's probably not built the same, even with the same company. So if we've got subject and 3 comparables, always make adjustments to what those comparables sold for. You never adjust what you think the subject might be worth, because that's what you're trying to figure out. You can't add or subtract from a question mark. 2 types of comps that can't be used. We talked about it already. Things that are currently active. In terms of making adjustments, we would still look at them just to see what the competition is like. That's another element of this whole process. But in using it for making adjustments, actives and under contracts don't help us any. We can't adjust those. All we're looking at from actives and under contracts are their listing prices. The under contracts aren't disclosed yet until they close. The actives, all they have is a listing price. And so they don't do us much good for making adjustments. We need solds for that. So we're trying to make that comparable property as much like the subject one as we can by adjusting it. And the most accurate value is going to come from making the fewest changes. If you can find a bunch of comparables that are already pretty darn close, similar to that subject, it's going to be a better match. It's going to be a more accurate figure. The more you have to start playing around with adjustment values and adding and subtracting, the less accurate you're probably going to get, because it's a lot of human guesswork and error potential in there. If we don't do a CMA competently, the real estate commission holds us accountable. That's scary. The first time you do a CMA, you're like, oh my gosh. It's like holding somebody's newborn, like 1 hour old baby. You're like, I know how to hold a baby, but this one just got hatched. And like, what do I do? How? The first CMA you do, you're like, somebody's trusting me to figure out what their house might sell for. Holy cow. But then you do it more and more and more. All the more important for a new agent just to do some. If there's a neighborhood that you live in or you like, or you want to kind of be the go-to agent for one day, go in there, pick the ones that are under contract, or even the actives, but you won't have to wait as long if you pick the ones that are under contract. Do a CMA and then just put an alert and wait and see what it sells for and see how good you were. Do your own little quiz, right? Your own little exercise, so that when you are face-to-face in a listing appointment having to do a real one because you're the one that they might hire, you've already done a dozen of them and you got kind of better at it. Right? So it's really just like anything, like going to the gym, it's repetitions. You get more comfortable with that stuff. And your BIC obviously will guide you through it and help you. That's a big question as a provisional broker you should lean on and ask your BIC. How do I handle adjustments in this neighborhood? What about this neighborhood? What about this price range versus that price range? Because dollars per square feet is different in different areas, of course. So we got to be good at performing these CMAs, and if we don't do it right, and we are negligent, more specifically, if we skip it, like that first agent on my friend's dad's house, she didn't even do one. If somebody wanted to turn her in for that, the commission might have something to say about it, right? It's not okay to just swoop in there and basically say, what do you want for it? Okay, sounds good. I got my sign in the car. You need to show them stuff. Here's a term. It's time for break. We'll come back and talk about a couple of these things, make a few more adjustments, and I'll see you back here in 10. Welcome back. There we go. We left off looking at this particular definition. And the word is correlation. And all it really means is using the adjusted values to determine that final probable sales price range. So correlation is essentially the equal sign. After making those adjustments for all of those 3 or 4 comparables, therefore, I think the subject property will likely sell for this number. That's what correlation is talking about. Let's look at this one. Subject property has 2 bedrooms, and the comparable property has 3. Let me show it to you on this over here instead. There we go. The estimated value of that 3rd bedroom is $2,500. According to the sales comparison method, the appraiser should do what? Notice you don't actually have to do any calculation here. They're just asking you what you're going to do with that number. So let's just ignore the answer choices for a second and think about it. We've got a subject. Got a subject right here. And we've got a comparable. Subject has 2 bedrooms. The comparable has 3. Get your hands out. Get your hands ready. Comparable has 3. Subject has 2. What do we need to do with this comparable to get it down to the level of the subject? We need to subtract. So it's going to be some kind of subtraction. The estimated value is $2,500. So the appraiser needs to subtract. It's going to be one of the deduct ones. $2,500 from the value of the subject or from the value of the comparable. What do we do with it? Do we ever adjust the subject? We don't know what the subject is worth. That's what we're trying to figure out. Or in our case, what it should sell for. So yeah, C is the best answer there. We're going to subtract that $2,500 from the comparable property sale price, because that's what we know it's sold for. We're trying to figure out what the subject will likely sell for. Let's look at another one. Subject property has a 2-car garage. 2-car. Comparable down the street, sold for $245 a month ago. Is superior to the subject because it has a 3-car garage. Everything else is the same. A garage is worth $5,000. The adjustment. What's the probable sales price? We've got our comparable. We've got our subject. The comparable is bigger. It's got more of a garage. 3-car versus 2. So we need to do what? To bring it down to the level of the subject, we're going to need to subtract $5,000 from that $245 to get an adjusted sale price of $240,000. See how that works? We okay? Then let's take a look at this one. Subject property has 2.5 bathrooms. House in the same neighborhood sold for $175,000 last week. Inferior because it has only 2 bathrooms. There's a half bath difference. Everything else the same. Broker figures a full bath adjustment would be $3,000. A half bath adjustment would be $1,500. By the way, I need to change that in this sample problem because it is not realistic. It's not real world that half bath is always half the value of a full bath. I should probably make it like 1,800 or maybe 2,000, something like that. But let's just go with what's there. What's the difference between the subject and the comparable? It's a half bath's worth. And the comparable is inferior to the subject, so we need to add to it to what it sold for in order to bring it up to the level of the subject. So we're going to add the value of a half bath. In this case, we'll go with the 1,500. We're adding that 1,500 to what the comparable sold for. So it's what is that? 180,000. I'm sorry, 177,000. Oops, I was looking at my wrong number. 176.5. Thank you. We're adding 1,500 to that 175. They might give you just something like this with one adjustment to make. They might give you 2 or 3 like I showed you initially. But the key is, are we adding to the comparable or are we subtracting from it? And some of it might involve a dollar per square foot situation. Let's look at something like that. All right. We have a subject property and a comparable. The comparable sold for $250 last week. The subject has 3 bedrooms. Comparable has 3 bedrooms also. The subject is 2,700 square feet. The comparable is 3,000 square feet. Dollars per square foot adjustment that we've discovered through our research. $93 per square foot. Subject has a 1-car garage. Comparable has a 2-car garage. And the subject is brick. The comparable is wood siding. A garage adjustment would be $12,000. And the brick versus wood adjustment would be $12,000 per side of brick, and it's a full brick house. What is this comparable going to adjust to with these various numbers? I'll give you some time and we'll talk about it. How are we doing? First, let's take a look at the square feet. What's the difference in the square footage? How many square feet are we dealing with? 300 of them, and it's $93 per square foot. So 300 times 93 adjusted. It's a $27,900 adjustment. But what are we doing to that comparable price that it's sold for? Are we adding or subtracting that $27,900? Comparable is more than, so it needs to be subtracted. Here's our comparable up here. Here's our subject down here. We need to take away dollars from what the comparable sold for in order to get it down to the level of the subject's square feet. So we're going to subtract 27,900. What about the garage? How much is it worth for the adjustment? $12,000. Comparable is superior to the subject. We need to therefore take away, subtract from what it sold for, because it too is superior, just like it is for square feet. So we're subtracting another $12,000 for the garage. And then the comparable is inferior to the subject in terms of siding. And so here we are, the comparable, it was wood, the subject is brick. We need to add to what the comparable sold for in the amount of $12,000 per side. And it's, let's say, a 4-sided house. So 12,000 times 4, that's $48,000. And when we do all that math, the 250 minus the 27,900 minus the 12,000 plus the 48,000, that comparable would have theoretically sold for $258,100 after making those adjustments. How do we feel about that? Does that make sense? You might see that. You might also see just, again, the numbers given, and then they're asking you, are you adding or subtracting, like we saw in one of those examples. So be watching and aware of either of those possibilities. Let's talk about the cost approach. Cost approach is based on this principle of substitution. We're substituting one thing for another, right? We're saying, well, there's not a neighborhood full of old schools, so how much would it cost to build this thing new? And now let's adjust for the condition that it is in. So the maximum value of a property is set by the cost of acquiring an equally desirable and valuable substitute property. That's what we're doing with this cost approach. Now, in real life, how frequently is a broker doing this? Unless you're a commercial broker, I doubt very often. It's pretty much the sales comparison method unless you're working with investors, in which case that income approach might be something. But the appraiser's using it. The appraiser's doing some version of this method. And what do you need to know for the test? Here's the steps to the cost approach. Most important, don't depreciate the land. So figure out what the land is worth and kind of just set it to the side. How much is those acres worth? We're not going to take a percentage discount off of that number because land can't be depreciated. Next step is to estimate the current cost of building it new. What the cost of it new would for the buildings and the improvements would be. Next step, and we'll see an example here in a second, is to depreciate the stuff we came up with in number 2. We're not going to depreciate the land. We're just going to depreciate the improvements. And then deduct that amount for depreciation from the estimated construction cost to build it new. Then we've put the land value back in it to get the total property estimated value. Let me show you this, and then we'll go back to that other slide. So here's an example from the book. At the top, we've got the land value plus improvements, $8,000. Or sorry, total is $35,000. The land value is 27 based on a 450 per front foot. However, they're telling you in the good question. For the purposes of the question is, why can't land depreciate if the economy tanks and I might not be able to sell it for the same price I could now? In terms of determining the value of the property, this is one of those things where I just have to tell you, this is how they do it, and this is what you're going to see on the test. I'll think about it. Maybe I can come up with a better answer, but all I know is land in and of itself, it could lose value. Sure, it might sell for less today because of economic reasons like buyer's market versus seller. But is it losing value because of depreciation? No. Right? So your point is well made, but this depreciation we're talking about here. The thing that depreciates are those improvements, because that stone building can crumble, that roof can become obsolete and start leaking. And so that's what's happening here. We've got the building, where'd it go? Oh, there we go. So the land value they're coming up with here is that plus the sidewalks and driveways, all that is coming up at $35,000. That's the land value that we're going to set off to the side. Now we're going to figure out how much would it cost to build those buildings today. And at $1,500 a square foot times 65, can you tell this is an old example? Dollars a square foot, that's $97,500. But we've got to now depreciate that $97,500. And because of the fact that it has some maintenance problems, some deferred maintenance, they need to paint it. It's also got some deterioration, some incurable problems that are in the form of structural deterioration, another $97,500, and something called functional obsolescence we'll learn about in a second. All of those problems, types of depreciation, add up to $15,750. If we subtract that $15,750 from the $97,500, then the depreciated value of the building is $81,750. Now we pull back in the $35,000 value of the lot to get our cost approach estimated value of $116,750. So you see, they took the land, then they calculated the new construction price for the improvements, then they subtracted for depreciation and added the land back in. Very testable part is that land doesn't appreciate. How would you handle a cost approach? You would not depreciate the land. A couple of definitions to think about. When it comes to the cost approach, are we factoring in reproduction cost or replacement cost? What's the difference? Tell me what you might think about reproduction versus replacement. What's going to cost more? An exact reproduction or just a replacement of something's function? Best example I can come up with there is like a historic home, right? So you've got a 100-year-old home with a very ornate front door that is now almost completely rotten, and you need to replace it. Are you going to go to Lowe's and buy a front door? The historic zoning committee would have something to say about that. You won't be allowed to, for one thing. And so you're going to have to get it reproduced true to the nature of the period, right? So that reproduction cost is going to be an exact replica, and it's going to cost a lot more than just a functional, give me a door, order it from Lowe's, and it doesn't even match anything, but it serves the purpose of a door. That would be a replacement cost. So replacement cost, more of a functional thing using modern materials and methods versus reproduction cost. So unless you're dealing with a historic property, you're probably going to be working with replacement costs, or that appraiser will. in determining the cost approach. There are a couple of ways that they come up with the value of those improvements, the structure and the improvements. An appraiser likes the square footage method. They're just going to straight up come up with a cost per square foot of the comparable times the number of square feet of the subject. They're going to look at several comparables and say, this one sold for 105 per square foot, this one sold for 115, and this one sold for 97. And so let's take whichever one of those is most like the subject. Let's kind of lean more toward that number. Maybe the 115 is most like the subject, so we'll stay toward the upper end. Maybe we'll pick $110 a square foot, multiply by how big the subject is. And that's how they might estimate in this cost approach. If it's a contractor, they're going to either look at it one of two ways. How much is each 2x4? Each pound of concrete, each bag of concrete, I guess it would be a yard of concrete, all the various raw materials, plus how much would it cost to install them. And that method is called the quantity survey method. You're looking at all the quantities involved in a structure. That's how you can remember it. You're adding up quantities piece by piece. Contractors might use this method. They could also take the shorthand version. Anybody ever count calories? Been like on a diet, counted calories? Have you heard of counting macros instead of counting calories? Calories would be every gram of fat, protein, and carbohydrate. Counting macros would be a chicken breast has 43 grams of protein in it. The chunk, right? So the unit in place method is to put in a foundation costs this much money. I don't care about each brick. I just know to put in a foundation of this size costs this amount. Oh, and now we're going to do the framing. That's this chunk. So it kind of reminds me of a modular home, right? We're coming up with chunks of value and adding them to each other. That's the unit in place method. The cost per unit of the individual components of the structure. Now that we've come up with a new construction price in some method or another, the appraiser is now going to calculate depreciation. And they're going to look at a variety of things. We need to look at some definitions here. Physical deterioration, that's not hard to figure out. How worn is it? How worn down is it? Are repairs physically possible and economically feasible? Curable means you can fix it. You can cure it. Incurable means you can't. So some example of an incurable deterioration might be the load-bearing walls. Is it just going to be too cost prohibitive to do the work it needed to repair that? Maybe the band sill, which is the lowest part of the structure up against the foundation wall, maybe that's completely rotted away and eaten away by termites. That involves jacking up the house and replacing that 2x12 piece of lumber doubled up all the way around the house. Maybe because of maybe the crawl space is super low, almost impossible to get in there. You'd have to maybe go into the house and pull up the floors. I've had one like that before where they had to go into the living room, roll back the carpet, and cut away the subfloor to get into the crawl space because it was less than a foot. Nobody was small enough to fit in there to do the work. So incurable might be something like that. Foundations, load-bearing walls. Curable would be typical maintenance issues. The roof is old. The paint needs to be painted. We can handle that. So because the roof is old, how much is it going to be to replace a roof? $15,000. How much is it going to be to repaint the house? $8,000 for the inside, $10,000 for the outside. I'm totally pulling numbers from air here. And then routine maintenance. That's kind of what the appraiser's thinking. How much is it for these various things that this property needs, not house, because we're talking about the cost approach, this building, this school, this church, this government building. And you can imagine if it's any of those kinds of buildings, all of these numbers are going to be pretty big because those are big buildings. That's physical deterioration. Functional obsolescence means there's some sort of an undesirable characteristic or design feature. So the other day, I'm always, because of my personal situation, I'm looking at rentals and I'm looking at purchase possibilities. And I found one for sale. and it's in a neighborhood I like, but the interior is so far outdated. But the one main thing about that interior is the living room is what's called a, oh shoot, I just blanked. What's it called? It's a sunken living room. That's what it's called. You have to step down into it. All the rest of the house is a certain level, but the living room requires a step down. And I would call that functional obsolescence. In a market like this, in a modern kind of floor plan, you're kind of weeding out and eliminating a certain segment of buyer potential. If I were to put something like that on the market, well, guess who I'm maybe going to lose as a potential buyer? People who are in a wheelchair, people who need help with mobility. They don't need an extra level to deal with. In fact, I found myself looking at it and looking over at the far wall where the fireplace and the window and the door to the back porch was. And I'm thinking, is there room there to raise the floor and still leave all of that? And maybe just bump the window up, bump the door up, but leave the fireplace the way it is. And then just raise everything the 8 inches that it needs for that one step. And I think there probably was. It also had this very 80s looking chair rail molding, and all the moldings were wood grain instead of, what's popular now, white and gray and stuff. So functional obsolescence, undesirable design feature, right? Is it fixable? In that case, yeah, that's not crazy, not too out of the scope. But what if it's like a 5-bedroom house with only 1 bathroom? What could you do there? And maybe, let me make it worse, it's not on a crawl space, because you're thinking, well, if it's a crawl space, you can run the plumbing under there, but it's a slab. Now you have to bring in a jackhammer and jackhammer up a channel to run the drain for the bathroom that you might want to add. Now we're getting into maybe too cost prohibitive. The functional obsolescence of a 5-bedroom but only 1 bathroom property. Or maybe it doesn't have AC, and to put it in would be ridiculously expensive because of how hard it is to access in the attic. My attic, I have a sort of a family friend who does heating and air, but I would never call him and ask him for help with my heating and air system in the attic, because it would be such a bear for him to crawl up in there and deal with. I had to empty out the little catch pan under it a couple of months ago, like 3 or 4 times. You can never just do that sort of thing once. And I'm not as limber as I'd like to be. And I thought, no, I'm not going to call Ed, because I don't want to do it to the poor guy. I'm going to call just a rank stranger, normal company. So I would never want to add the ductwork and have to put in the system in something like that. It might be just too cost prohibitive to do so. That's functional obsolescence. The curable version, those were incurable versions, but the curable might just be swapping out fixtures, converting rooms. Maybe that 5-bedroom, 1-bathroom house isn't as impossible. Maybe it is on a crawl space, and maybe we could give up a bedroom and make it into a bathroom. Let's make it a 4-bedroom, 2-bath instead of a 5-bedroom, 1-bath. So it all depends on the specific property. There's also economic depreciation, and that's just incurable no matter what, because that just means you have no control over the problem. It's down the road. There's a landfill. There's the noise of the asphalt plant, the smell of it, the air traffic overhead because you're right near an airport. So that appraiser would have to subtract an amount to account for the less desirability, because you're right under the air traffic pattern. Constant noise shakes the stuff off the shelves. It's outside of the owner's control. So the appraiser, for each of these 3 possible things that might exist in this property, would make an adjustment. They would just add that to the list of depreciated numbers that we're going to subtract from the cost to build it new. Economic, here's a very important, very likely test question. Which type of depreciation is always incurable? Look for differences like that, and that answer would be economic depreciation, because it's outside of the owner's control. Depreciation just being a loss in value for any reason. So what two things cannot be depreciated? Definitely land. I don't think we covered the other one. The other one is your personal residence. You don't factor in depreciation with your personal residence or with land. Land and personal residence, you don't depreciate. Most appraisers use something called the breakdown method when determining depreciation. And they're going to have estimates for both curable and incurable factors in each of those three classes. The classes being this: physical deterioration, functional obsolescence, and economic depreciation. So out of all three, do they have a number are there some curable items and incurable items for each of the three, or any of the three? They're going to look for that and come up with estimates as needed. The older the building is, the harder it will be to estimate depreciation. The list is going to be longer, right? You're dealing with something way old compared to something brand new. The easiest method is something called the age-life method. It uses the effective age of the property plus its economic or useful life. What's an effective age? What's the difference between effective age and actual age? Well, my actual age is 51 years old, and I've been working out for a couple of weeks now. I'm starting to feel a little more lively. So I'm going to say my effective age will give me 47 at this moment. I hope to work down to maybe 40 or 35 in the next 3 months, but that's what we're talking about. Effective age is you just put in new heating and air system. You just put in a new water heater, updated the kitchen and bath. So really, that 50-year-old house is more like a 5-year-old house because you put a bunch of new stuff in it. The effective age is less than the chronological age or the actual age. The straight line method of depreciation is the cost of the asset depreciated evenly. It's all done with numbers, right? Just on paper, depreciated evenly over its useful life. How long is it likely to be in good operation? That's the useful life or economic life, as you can see up here. Economic or useful life. How long will it be useful without having to put more money in it? Depreciation is assumed to occur at an even rate over its economic life. So a straight line method is just taking that depreciation and applying it evenly over however long that useful life is. Annual depreciation would be taking that property's cost and dividing it by the number of years of economic or useful life. We'll look at some of those math problems later. The age-life method is the effective age and the economic life. So how long is the property expected to remain useful? That's the economic or useful life. Actual life is the period it's expected to remain standing. So those are the two numbers the age-life method is using. Straight line method, that even rate over the course of that useful life. So an age is placed on the building by an appraiser based on its condition and its design. What does it feel like versus what is it really? I feel like 45, but I'm really 51. Appraiser will always state the actual chronological age on that appraisal report, but they will estimate and give a value, a number, an age for their guess as to, based on the condition, the fact they've done a bunch of upgrades and updates and it's in pretty good shape, its effective age is actually 20 years old instead of the chronological 30 that it really is. It was built 30 years ago, but it's got a new roof. It's got a new water heater. Kitchen is updated. But it still has some original flooring. It still has maybe plaster instead of sheetrock, and it's showing some cracks. So effective age 20 years, actual age 30 years old. Of the three approaches to value, sales comparison method, cost approach, and income capitalization method, those three approaches, the cost approach always is the highest value. That's why the appraiser can't average them. It wouldn't be an accurate estimate of value. They would have to give more weight to the cost approach if it's indeed one of these kinds of buildings. Schools, churches, libraries. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Hospitals, government buildings, things that aren't income producing, but also aren't things you can get comparables for. We good on the cost approach? The next one and the final one is the income approach or income capitalization approach. And you investor-minded folks might be more interested in this one because this is real world. Good to know what the net operating income is and how that is created, how that is derived. So it's based on not so much the looks and the curb appeal. You might have a house, a condo across the street from a university, and it could cash flow a pretty decent amount because you're going to have a steady stream of potential tenants at all times. People who want to walk to class. It's not pretty, but it's a good investment. It's a good real estate choice. So we're looking at the income approach. It's based on the present worth of the future rights to income. And so your client wants to get a good indication of what's this thing going to be worth from a financial perspective. Income from renters minus the cost to maintain it. Going to have to re-roof it at some point. Going to have to paint it from time to time, put carpet in from time to time. It assumes the income derived from a property controls the value of the property. They want to look much more closely at the income than what the one down the street sold for. So we're looking at the value of an income property based on similar income properties nearby. The net income of shopping centers, apartments, office buildings, rental houses. You'll look at you'll have an idea, an appraiser would have an idea of what similar types of investment properties deal with in terms of operating costs. And they'll compare it to this one. And it brings us to this equation. Nice and color coded. So the given acronym stands for gross income minus vacancy minus expenses. The purpose of the given acronym here is to derive the net operating income, NOI. Net operating income is one of lots of measures that an investor looks at when they are analyzing a potential investment property, because it takes into account the most you could possibly earn from rent, subtracts out the very real world problem of vacancy not being 100%, and the cost to send people to collections. There's cost involved with that too. And then also the cost to run the business. If it's a 100-unit apartment building, we talked a little bit about that last night, might involve an on-site manager, got to pay a salary, might involve a cleaner, housekeeper for like the common areas and any sort of public areas. Might involve keeping the parking lot paved and in good repair. Out of all those possible expenses, which we'll see here in a minute, there's one very big possible expense that is not included in this list. And that one is called what? Anybody have a guess? What expense, what major expense when you own a property, if you choose to own it in a certain way, what's a major expense that you might deal with when you own a property? Even somebody living in a house just because they want to be an owner and live in it, owner occupied. Probably the number one expense, more than your power bill and your water bill. It requires at closing a closing disclosure instead of a HUD-1 form. There it is, the loan payment. The other word for loan payment, debt service. The debt service, servicing the debt. Your debt is the loan amount you're borrowing to purchase this property, and so therefore your monthly payment. That is not a factor in determining net operating income. We don't include that in the expenses. We do include all the other stuff. Power bill, water bill, management fee, on-site person, landscaper, anything you could imagine, everything except debt service. So when you see net operating income, you can think to yourself, that doesn't include the loan. We'll talk about why in a second. So we have the gross income. That's the rent collected if 100% occupancy were attained. All 100 units had somebody in there paying the rent. That's the gross income. Not very realistic because we got to now subtract out for the likelihood that it's going to have a few of those 100 units, maybe 4 or 5 of them, with nobody in them at any given moment. So if it's a 5% vacant property, then it's a 95% occupied property. So we could call it a 5% vacancy rate or a 95% occupancy rate. And when we subtract that vacancy rate from the gross potential income, we're left with a number called the effective gross income. So effective just means we've allowed for the possibility of vacancy. There's going to be a handful of the properties that, or units, that don't have anybody in there paying rent. Now we take that effective gross income and subtract everything you can think of that you pay yourself in the place you live in right now, but applied to an income property that you own, right? Property insurance, maintenance and repairs, management fees. You may not be dealing with that where you are. Utilities, though, property taxes, everything except the mortgage, also known as debt service. And when we take that item, subtract that along with the vacancy, we end up with this magical figure that investors look at as one of several measures to determine, should I buy this one? What is its net operating income? How much income am I going to have after the expenses have been paid? Does that make sense? Why are mortgage expenses not included in the operating income? Because appraisers always assume it's a cash purchase. They don't care if you're borrowing or if you're paying cash. They're just trying to tell you what the property is likely worth. And so the mortgage expenses are not relevant to this calculation of net operating income. Now, profit or cash flow, we're going to go down to the next level. And if it is a property with debt service, we subtract that mortgage payment debt service number from the NOI, and we're left with cash flow. It might be that you have none. You have no debt service. You've chosen to buy it in all cash. So if you're an investor and you have $1 million in cash, would you rather own a property worth $1 million free and clear? Or would you rather own 2 properties leveraged with a 50% LTV? You have mortgages on 2 properties earning income versus no mortgage on 1 property that you own completely. That's just a business decision. What's your risk tolerance, right? Are you willing and you feel confident in having 2 mortgages? Can you get 2 mortgages? You'll probably grow your wealth faster if you multiply and have the 2 that you have a mortgage on for 50% LTV versus just 1 paid off property. But Dave Ramsey would probably prefer you pay off the property and have 1 paid for one. It just depends on your tolerance and what you want to do. Now, let's talk about this word that looks scary, but it's not. Who has a savings account? Park some money at the bank. Just maybe because you don't want to have access to it by swiping your card. Maybe you're playing some tricks on yourself like that. Valid. Good reason to do so. How much do you earn parking your money in that savings account. You happen to know? Not enough to keep up with inflation, is it? Maybe like 1 or 2%, right? It's pitiful, but it's pretty darn safe, pretty solid. If you won the lottery, 50 million bucks, would you put it in a savings account? If you wanted to be super conservative, you would still make a pretty decent chunk at that level, but most likely you're going to put it in something that earns more like 8 or 10% return per year. You're going to park it in something still relatively safe, but bringing you back a return on your money. Or any amount of money you invest. That's your decision. How risky do I want to get? Or how much of this chunk of money I have am I going to put in a thing that's more risky versus not? Yeah, Ally's always been a better savings account rate. Victor points that out. But a lot of them are shamefully low. Point is, whether it's 2 or 4.5 or 10, that's kind of what we're talking about with cap rate. Capitalization rate is the rate that lets the investor realize a reasonable return. It's sort of the rate of return related to the NOI. Capitalization rate. When you talk to a commercial real estate person, they're going to throw this number around a little bit. Let me show you what that looks like. There we go. So if we were to look at this popular website, anybody heard of LoopNet? LoopNet is a commercial listing site, sort of like the MLS. It's where you post commercial properties for sale. You have to pay extra. This is actually free to look at, but if you want to actually list something on it, you'd have to pay. Not super cheap either. I pulled up an office building for sale in Charlotte off of McCullough Drive. Looks like it's for sale for $55 million. And look what they say. It has a 3.93% capitalization rate. So as you go down through, you might look through this LoopNet and see that office complexes tend to have cap rates in this certain area around that 3 to 4% range. Or if we decide to look at maybe industrial properties. Let's see here. Let's check industrial properties. See if they give us a cap rate in this one. Sometimes you have to look around a little bit. But we'll see likely a different capitalization rate for industrial properties. So different ones just depend on what that return might be. In commercial real estate, the brokers tend to specialize in certain parts. It's not rarely, unless it's a firm that only has one commercial person, maybe they're more of a generalist. But for the most part, commercial people find that if they can be an expert on offices alone, maybe like 4 to 5 story office buildings versus high rises, they niche down. They probably do that because they can make more money doing so, because they can get to be really expert at that certain category of commercial property. I'm sure there's a financial reason they do that. It tends to be that's how it works in commercial. Now I can't find any cap rates under industrial, but if you're doing industrial, if you're doing offices, you know what your capitalization rate is for properties like that. Sometimes when I'm teaching a post-licensing class, I'll have a guest speaker dial in, and his name is Michael Bull. If you're somewhat interested in commercial real estate, you can find him. Let's see. On YouTube. He's got a pretty good, there we go. He calls it the America's Commercial Real Estate Show. And you can just see lots of things, and they'll just throw around this banter, this sort of commercial talk. And so when he dials in, there he is. I'll mute him. A lot of interviews. He's the guy on the left. He will talk about, he specializes in Atlanta, Georgia office space. And I believe, if I recall, the last time was a couple of years ago that he joined us, but I think he said the office cap rate was around 6 or 7%, I believe. But he definitely knew it. He had it off the top of his head because he sees it all the time. So capitalization rate, why does it matter? Let's take a look at how we come up with it. There we go. Another way to consider it is the yield, or the rate of return an investor expects for the amount of capital they're putting into the building. The thing that's important about the cap rate is it is directly proportional to the value, and a good, safe estimate of value. It looks like this. If we were to look at it in a T formula, you notice cap rate is there down on the bottom. Hey, it's a rate. Rates go on the bottom, don't they? Every rate we've ever seen on this T formula. So if we take the cap rate and we also know the net operating income, how are we going to find that out? Then we'll take our break in just a second. How do we get the NOI for a given investment property? We're going to ask to see the financials. Show us your financials. Show us how much are you charging in rent? What's your gross rental income? What's your vacancy rate at the moment? What are your various operating expenses? Oh, wow. Look at their list of operating expenses. That's way too much for a manager. I could beat that. If I buy this, I can cut down on some of these operating costs. Might be what an investor's thinking. How can I whittle some money off of that? But you're going to see those financials to get that NOI. If you take that net operating income and divide it by the capitalization rate that you've determined because you know what it is for how properties like this in this area, that gives you the market value, or close approximation of what the market value is. And maybe that results in $4 million. The NOI divided by the cap rate equals $4 million as a value. How much are they asking for this property? $4.5 million? Sounds like they're a little inflated. I don't think I want to pay more than what the numbers seem to support. Oh, wait, no, they're asking 3.7 million. This might be a deal. Let me jump on this, because NOI divided by cap rate is showing me 4 and they're asking 3.7. So let me spend a little more time digging deeper on this one. That's kind of how they might apply that in real world. Now let's apply a break. I'll see you back here in 10. right, we left off with NOI and its relationship to market value being connected via the cap rate. An appraiser is going to estimate the capitalization rate of similar sold properties. She's going to look at other properties like this one, do the math, see what the cap rate is on those, and come up with what is the cap rate for this type of property in this part of town. And then apply that to the subject property. So how might that look? Notice too that, there we go. Anytime you have those two numbers on the bottom, as one of the numbers on the bottom goes up, the other one goes down. It's just a function of the math. So as that cap rate goes up, the higher the capitalization rate, the lower the market value, and vice versa. Right? So cap rates that are higher result in some lower market values. Let's look at an example. Again, we've got gross income, subtract out for vacancy and delinquency, gives us the effective gross income. We have subtracting out for operating expenses, that gives us the NOI. And the NOI divided by the market value is the cap rate, or NOI divided by cap rate is the market value. We'll dig into this a little more. I'm just kind of giving you the overhead view. If we go further and subtract from that NOI the amount we're paying for our loan, the debt service, then that gives us cash flow. I call it the vertical equation. That's the given one. And then the NOI has sort of a horizontal equation. That's relationship of market value and cap rate. Now we're down here at cash flow, and that has a relationship to an equity rate of return based on the cash flow. And that is the original investment. We'll look at that in a second. So let's take a look at something. If we have a property that it's a 100-unit, I don't know why I like these because it's just easy math. 100-unit apartment building. It earns, let's just keep it simple. There's only one kind of apartment there. They're all 2-bedroom, 1-bath. And so they all get $2,000 per month. It's got a 6% vacancy rate. And the operating expenses are $31,000 per month. I'm pulling numbers from air, so hopefully these will make some kind of sense. The cap rate for properties like this in this area is 7%. What's the approximate market value given all that information? I will do this one with you. What's our first thing we need to consider? Given, right? So what's the gross income? If it's a 100-unit apartment building earning $2,000 a month per unit, what's the most you could possibly earn as the investor owner of this building? $200,000 per month, or let's look at it annually. $2.4 million per year. If we're looking at it per year, now we know a vacancy rate is 6%. So let's we could do this a couple of different ways. We could calculate 6% of 2.4 million and subtract it from it. Or we could realize that 6% is the opposite of 94%. The vacancy rate is the opposite of the occupancy rate. So let's just take 94% of the 2.4 million. And we can just do this in one step. So after taking out for a vacancy rate, it's 2,256,000 as an effective net income. We okay so far? We needed to turn the monthly into annual. So that's one little nuance to think about. Now we're going to subtract out for operating expenses, and we were told that it's 31,000 per month. Let's go ahead and make that annual. If it's 31,000 per month, what is that per year? $372,000 per year. So let's subtract that. So we're not earning 2.2 million in a given year. We got to pay a bunch of bills. And once we pay those bills, we're left with a net operating income of $1,884,000. That's our NOI. I don't know what the debt service is. I didn't make it up yet. But we don't need it, because the only thing the question was asking is what's the market value if the cap rate is 7%. So let's apply that. Our NOI goes on top. Cap rate goes on the bottom, and market value goes on the bottom. So do we know either of these things that go on the bottom? We were told the cap rate is 7%. Let's plug it in. 1,884 divided by 7% means this property should be worth approximately $26,914,286. How much are they asking for it? Oh, they're asking 26 million even. Oh, they might be motivated. Based on our math, our calculations here, maybe this is something to jump on. Oh no, sorry, I was wrong. They're asking 28 million. Oh, they're trying to find a sucker. We don't want to pay too much for this thing. We'll give it a try. Let's maybe offer them 26.5 and see if they'll come down. Right? It might just give you sort of a way to strategize your offer. But what you do know is based on the NOI that you calculated and the cap rate that you've educated yourself to know exists in this market for this type of property, it's approximately worth the 26.9 million. How do you determine the cap rate? Well, you would look at a bunch of things that have sold similar to this, and you would see what were those NOIs and what did they sell for, and you'll just do it kind of backwards. Oh, look, there was one over here that had an NOI of $2 million. If our subject had an NOI of $1.8 million, let's say there was one over here that had an NOI of $2 million, and also it sold for $30 million. What would be the cap rate for that situation? $6. Oh, and then there was one over here that sold for $1,900,000. Just another comp. Sorry, the NOI was $1,900,000. It sold for, let's say, $29 million. Can't do that one in my head. See what I'm doing? I'm just going down through the things that have already sold to see what the cap rate is of each one of those. And oh, I'm starting to see a theme here. And then here's a third comparable that went for 2.1 million, had a $2.1 million NOI and then sold for, let's say, $28,500,000. What does the cap rate come out to be on that one? $7.3. So it looks like the cap rate is anywhere from 6 to 7.3 for similar properties. Now that you know typical cap rates, you can go back over and apply it to the subject property and say, what did we discover? Let's say that it's a little more like this property than the other two. So maybe we lean more toward that 6.5% cap rate. Now let's plug that one in instead of the 7. The 1,884,000 divided by the 6.5% means that it might actually be worth more like 28,984. See how that could work? See how an investor might interact with these numbers? What you just need to know for the test is the relationship of given to get the NOI, gross income minus vacancy minus operating income or operating expenses, gets you the NOI, and then the relationship of NOI to market value and cap rate. So just have a familiarity with that acronym and know kind of how to interact there, but it's not going to deep dive into super complicated math here. It's just kind of this level, just to kind of be familiar with. Take a look at something. There we go. If we go back over, because this is good to do every now and then, of course, reconcile everything with the syllabus. We have so far gone through this in this particular chapter. Started here, looked at the definitions of things. A real estate appraisal is done by who? An appraiser. Broker price opinion and a market analyses are done by brokers. We know that. The appraiser has an appraisal board that they have to follow. What are some of these concepts? I would go back through your printed version of this now from just what we talked about so far without looking and try to write out definitions of these words. Then go look it up and see how close you were and then correct it. That's going to stick in your head a lot better than if you just look it up and write it out because you're reading it to yourself. Make yourself work. If you make your brain work for it, it'll work better in retention. Elements of value. We talked about the DUST acronym. Forces and factors influencing value. Social, economic, government, environmental. Talked about all of that fun stuff. This one's pretty important. There's only one highest and best use at any time, but it could change. Substitution is the basis of the sales comparison approach because we are making adjustments, right? The process of evaluating things by an appraiser, define the problem, and then reconcile the approaches to estimate the final value. We talked about the sales comparison method. And how we as brokers need to call it the probable sales price that we generate, not a market value. That's what appraisers do. Need 3 to 4 comps of the same property type, residential, single family, condo, whatever it may be. So there's a lot of little nuggets in here of testable items, 3 to 4 comps, select comparables, location and date of sale are the two most important characteristics of choosing comps. Don't use currently listed ones or under contract ones as a comp for making adjustments to. And this concept of superior comparable versus inferior, is the comparable superior to the subject or inferior to it? There is no standard amount. I think I told you that funny little story an appraiser told me. There is no notebook. There is no binder that says all fireplaces are worth $3,000. It's all opinion. Top of the page of the appraisal report says it's an opinion, and they do it more than we do. Who's better at valuation, brokers or appraisers on average? The one who does it all the time. We brokers are sort of Jacks and Jills of all trades, right? We do lots of different things. One day we might be showing a bunch of property. Another day we might be going on a listing appointment. There's no way we can do as many valuation CMAs, BPOs as an appraiser does. That's all they do. They don't do it every day necessarily. They might split up their week and get a couple of orders that they accept, and so they go out in the field Monday and Tuesday. Then they come back to the office Wednesday and Thursday and do the math, do this sort of thing, or some combination of those. And the adjustments that are made are not for every single difference. It's the most important, the biggest ones that affect value. It's things like we've looked at: square footage, bathrooms, maybe bedrooms. But in the real world, I'm either going to do square footage or bedrooms. I'm not going to do both, probably. You won't be tested to that level. Siding types, garages, acreage, overall condition, if it's notably less than that you can tell from the pictures maybe. Kitchens and bath upgrades. I'm zooming in on pictures all the time trying to see what kind of counters do those look like, because they don't necessarily say so in the description. But I'm not looking for, is it granite or is it siltstone? It's probably about the same, pretty close between two kinds, versus Formica. That's like a vinyl product counter. Concrete versus granite. I don't know that I'd make all that big of an adjustment between those two things. Concrete is probably a little less popular, right? But then maybe it's granite from 10 years ago that's more beige instead of the black, white, gray kind of spectrum. Adjusted sales prices of the comps should end up in a tight range of value. So you see the importance of looking in the textbook and then talking here in class and then seeing what the syllabus sums it all up to mean. What's the most important thing? What the syllabus says. So be really familiar, read through that for every single chapter. Single indication of value should not be obtained by averaging the sales prices of the comps. So we've done our work in this sales comparison method. We've shown and come up with, we've got our subject, we've got our comps, 1, 2, 3. We've made our adjustments, and it shows that comp 1, after making adjustments, instead of selling for the $450 that it really sold for, it should have sold for $430. Comp 2 really sold for $455, but it adjusts down to, let's say, maybe $425. And then comp 3 sold for like $465, but it adjusted to maybe $432. Are we going to now take the average of these three numbers to come up with what this subject might be worth? No. We're going to say, how does comp 1 measure up to the subject? Is it more like it or less like it? Let's say out of all of these, the subject is really the most like comp 3. Well, good news for that seller, because in this range of $425 all the way up to $432, we could probably expect the subject property to be worth closer to the $432. More likely to sell for that price, I should say. Let's not use the W or the V word. But that's sort of what we're doing. And that's what they mean in the syllabus. Don't average it. Use a weighted averaging. Lean more toward the one that's more like the subject. So it's a lot of, in real world, for me, it's a lot of looking at what you know about the subject. Maybe you've been out there one time. You said, "Hi, I'm Neil. Let's take a look around so that I can go back to the office and do some homework and see what your house is likely to sell for." I'm not probably going to go out there and just give them a number first day. Number one, because I want to give them a better number than that. Number two, if they're interviewing multiple agents, it gives me a shot at maybe coming back at the end after they've interviewed the other ones and swooping in, hopefully. So it's sort of strategy, but it's also common sense. Why give them a price based on something that you just became familiar with? Now, if you get to the point in a certain neighborhood where you just know it upside down and backwards like the back of your hand, you might could be able to pull that off. But I would always try to use a little safety net there and say, first visit, I'm going to take a look. And it might be that instead of going back out for the second visit, I set up a Zoom call. Or I might make a video where I explain all this stuff, do a review of the market analysis I've prepared, and now I have it. I just did this for an estate sale. So it's a brother and two sisters. I've only met the one sister and the brother, but not the other one. She's like in Winston. And so I made a video. So it could be like this, and me saying, look, here's yours, and here's the comp, and I think this, and look over here. And I'm trying to both impress them and educate them on the CMA all at the same time. And now I have a product, a video that I can shoot out to them and they can share with other family members or whatever. Right? So whatever method you do, you should get familiar. I didn't do any of that until I went and visited it. And when I got there, old, dated, needs work, right? Is an old man who died. He and his wife, the wife died 10 years ago. He just died 3 months ago. And it needs a lot of things that my house needs. It's a tri-level like my house, so I could relate to him with that sort of thing. And I was comparing. Now that I've seen it firsthand, I can see what those comps look like, not in person, unfortunately, but on paper and pictures, and better compare them to this subject. We talked about the cost approach. Separate estimates of value for the building and the land, because the land doesn't depreciate, as we see down here. And we know what it's best suited for. By the way, when we determine the value of the land that we don't depreciate, how do we determine that value of that land? What method are we going to use to figure out what the land is worth, or will probably sell for? What approach? Which of the three approaches? Yeah, the one we just looked at, the comparable sales method. Remember, we use that method for single family and land. So with the cost approach, we're actually including and also having to do some sales comparison method. We got to do a CMA just for the land portion. That's how we figure out what the land is worth. What is similarly sized and zoned and usability? What are other types of lots and acreages selling for? Now we know how much to not depreciate, right? So a cost approach includes the sales comparison method, because we have to use the sales comparison method to get the value of the land. We talked about reproduction costs used to deal with historical property, but typically it's going to be the replacement cost method, which is one of these three. Quantity survey and the unit in place tends to be what contractors use. We're saying, what's a 2x4 worth? How much does it cost to install it? Or what's the whole foundation cost to put in? What's the whole roofing system cost to put in? And then appraiser tends to use the square footage method. How many dollars per square feet? Builders sometimes we'll talk to you about that when you're just out there in the wild and you meet a builder. They like to talk in terms of dollars per square feet. This is unrelated to this thing that we're talking about now, but dollars per square feet is funny to me because it assumes the house is kind of just floating in midair. It's like dollars per square feet, but how big is the lot? They don't account for that. It might be on a half acre. It might be on 3/4 of an acre. We need to kind of adjust for that by using what we know about land value. So it's one, builders love to lean on dollars per square feet. That's just their livelihood. It's just what they do. But it does have an element of inaccuracy because how big is the lot we're talking? Even the lots in the neighborhoods they build in, I guarantee they have premium lots they charge an extra $8,000 for because it's in a cul-de-sac where you can put a basement on there. And so that needs to be considered. As you as a broker talking to your client and the builder's spouting numbers about dollars per square foot to build, it's like, okay, yeah, but let's think about what that means. Is it on a city water, city sewer? Do we have to allow for septic tank? Do we have to drill a well? Does all that factor into this dollar per square foot they're talking about? No. They're just talking about putting a house up. Then we need to think about what kind of lot we're putting it on and the things that that lot might need. But back to this. Then we came down to depreciation, and we need to know some definitions. Depreciation, how much worse is it than when it was new? Effective age, how young does it feel, right? Economic life, useful life. How long is it good for before it's going to need more work? Those depreciation methods, the straight line method, the market abstract method, the breakdown method. Notice these two are just level one. What is the definition of them? So that's the basic thing you need to know about that. But then these are the three areas the appraiser is going to assign a value for depreciation to. What things need to be done that are fixable versus unfixable under physical depreciation, under functional obsolescence, under economic that you can't control. They're just going to subtract numbers from each of these in each of these categories. Let's allow, because of physical depreciation or deterioration, $30,000 because we need to fix the roof. We need to repaint everything, put in heating and air system, brand new water heater. Maybe it's like a boiler system because it's an old school. Functional obsolescence, economic. The appraiser just saying, subtract this amount because of this amount because of that. That's depreciation. Then add that depreciated amount back into the land value, and we have a cost approach estimate of value. So how do they get this in the cost approach? They estimate the current replacement or reproduction cost, as we saw in that copy of something from your book. Estimate the depreciation and subtract, and then put the land in it as if the land were vacant. Then we got to income approaches, and we're halfway through it. We talked about how income approach is based on the present worth of rights to future income. It's used for investment property. There's a cap rate. Capitalization rate is like a rate of return. Measures the risk of the investment. The higher the cap rate, the higher the risk. The higher the cap rate, the lower the market value. As the cap rate goes up, market value goes down, and vice versa. Something called the direct capitalization method for properties that are more than 1 to 4 units. We talked about net operating income and how that's related to cap rate and market value. And that's pretty much where we are so far. So at this point, should have already been doing that along the way. But if you haven't, start doing that and get really close to the syllabus. As you're reviewing, go back and compare it to the text book chapters. Okay. There we go. Now, this is what we use, or what an appraiser would use, or an investor would use to analyze an income producing property. What if you just want to maybe buy a small rental property, just a residential rental property? Super basic, super plain. Do you need to go into all of this detail? No. There are other ways to figure out what something is roughly worth. One of them is the gross rent multiplier method. It's just a shortcut, quick, hey, let me just rule of thumb, let me just estimate real quick based on the rent that they're making, the rent that they're getting for this property. And so because of your research, you will have determined a gross rent multiplier, basically a rate. It's another rate. And the T formula looks like this. What is it worth? Is a combination of the rent that's being earned per month times this magical number called the gross rent multiplier, maybe like 8.7, something like that. So if the rent is $2,000 a month times the gross rent multiplier that you, well, I guess it would be bigger than that, that you've determined, should give you a rule of thumb idea of what the market value is. And that's it. In the test, they would give you two of these things, and you could say, they'd say, how much should this market value be? What would you not want to spend more than to get this property? And just remember this T formula. It might be that we know that the property rents for $630, to pull an example from the book. That's the monthly rent. And because of our research, we know that the gross rent multiplier for properties like this in this area is 126.2. That's just like doing our cap rate research. We're looking at a bunch of things that have sold, market values, and the rents that they could earn, and we're coming up with an average GRM. So if we take both of these things, $630 a month times the 126.2, it shows that a market value of approximately $79,506. It's what we would not want to probably spend more than. Helps you understand real quickly, without looking too in depth of the operating costs, what you would want to spend for it. So it's a very rough estimate. Out of the approaches to value, the appraiser has maybe it's an investment property, and they've done a sales comparison method, they've done a cost approach method, and they've done the income method, and they all came back with different estimates of value. So what does the appraiser do next? Using their expertise, they say, oh, which one is this the most like? Oh, it's an income property. Let's give more weight to the value I came up with using the income method when I looked at the net operating income, the cap rate, and used all of those sorts of numbers. So that's reconciliation. The appraiser's reconciling all of the various factors into which of the different methods are the best ones to look at more closely. Because again, the appraiser would not average those three. From those three approaches, they're going to weight them. More weight given to the one that's the most appropriate for the subject property. What's the first step in the appraisal process? You might see this on the test. This is very testable. First step, define the problem. Why is the appraiser appraising it? For a purchase? For a refinance? What's the point? What are they doing this for? And the last step of the appraisal process, that reconciliation. Looking at the three different methods of valuation and figuring which one do I give more weight to. So you might see an example like this. Mitch and Mary, have I been yapping away and not sharing? Let me catch you up. All that talk was this. There we go. The gross rent multiplier, there it is, the formula itself. the rent amount on the bottom, the gross rent multiplier also on the bottom, multiplied together to get the price. And then here's reconciliation that we were talking about. I'll add these. I don't have these in the list, but I'll add these to the slides this week. And there's our reconciliation. Okay, Mitch and Mary want to sell their 3-bedroom, 2-bath home. It sits on a half an acre lot. It's built in 1968, has a double-car garage and a sunroom. The best comparable property was built at the same time, has 3 bedrooms, same, 2.5 baths, superior, half-acre lot, same, double-car garage, same, and no sunroom, inferior, right? Current sold data indicates that a bedroom is worth $5,000, a bathroom is worth $6,000, the garage is worth $30,000, and a sunroom is worth $45,000, and 1 acre is worth $100,000. The correct adjustments would be what? Let me see if I can. There we go. See if I can work this out. As you're working through it, I'm going to try to make this pretty so I can share some things with you. Here we go. Okay. So what do we have here? We've got a subject property, got the comparable property, and that subject is 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. I'm going to ignore the things that are the same. Subject is 2 baths, comparable is 2.5. So that comparable needs to be subtracted for a half a bath's worth, whatever that is, which is a dollar amount of something we'll look at in a second. What else? Half acre lot is the same. 2-car garage is the same. Sunroom is different. So subject has a sunroom. Comparable does not. And so we need to add for that sunroom. So bedroom is worth $5,000 is irrelevant. We don't need to know that because the bedrooms are the same, right? Bath is worth $6,000 and that's all they give us. So we can just make the assumption that a half bath is worth $3,000 for our purposes of this test. So we're going to be subtracting $3,000 from what the comparable sold for. Did I give you what it, oh, we don't need to know what it sold for. The question is, how much are we adjusting this for? How much are all the adjustments going to be? A sunroom is worth $45,000. So the only differences between these two were a sunroom and a bathroom. And so it's adding $45,000 for the sunroom and subtracting $3,000 for the bathroom. So the total adjustments are going to be a positive or an addition of $42,000 of stuff to whatever that comparable sold for. Does that make sense? In this case, we don't have to subtract it or add it to the comparable price. They didn't give us the comparable price anyway, but all they were asking for was how much the adjustment would be for, and it's going to be some version of added. Are we going to add $42,000 to what the subject sold for or what the comparable sold for? So it's going to be 4 or D. In this case, 4. Because we never adjust the subject. We always adjust the comp. And when we see these answer choices, it's easy to weed them out. No subject. So that just leaves the comparable. Broker Billy. Make an adjustment here. Broker Billy has a listing appointment for a 3,600 square foot home on a 2-acre lot. The home is on the main channel of a popular lake, has 5 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, a pool and spa, boat dock with a boat lift, cedar shake exterior, and a 3-car garage. The recent solds that match this home, the most recent one has 3,800 square feet, 200 feet larger, 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, so another bathroom difference, sold for $2.2 million. The recently sold home is lakefront with a boat dock but no boat lift. Has a 3-car garage just like the subject, brick exterior which is superior to cedar shake. The correct adjustment for this home would be what? We don't have to add them up this time. We just need to make a list. You might use your scratch paper and say, what's superior and inferior? For the comparable, it is superior in terms of square feet. So we're going to subtract a square footage adjustment of some sort. So we're going to look down through those answer choices and see wherever it talks about subtracting for square footage. And I see number 3 does that. So that's a possibility. We might write this out on the scratch paper and then look at the whole, right? Next one, what? What are we doing about the bathroom? The subject has 3.5 baths. The comparable has 4. So how are we going to handle an adjustment for the bathroom? Adding or subtracting? Yeah, I'm going to subtract from what the comparable sold for. So where do we see? Oh, there's number 3 again. Subtract for the half bath. So far, that's looking pretty good. Number 2 talks about adding for both, and that's not right. So we can weed out number 2. Add the value of half a bathroom. Nope, that's not right either for number 1. Then number 4 talks about subtracting the value of a boat lift. Let's talk about that. The subject has a dock and a lift. The comparable has a dock but no lift. So what's our adjustment going to be for that item? Adding or subtracting because of the lift? Comparable is inferior to the subject. We need to add to it, right? But they don't have any answer choice that allows for that. They talk about subtracting for the lift and adding for the dock, and that's not applicable. The docks are the same. They both have a dock, and the lift would need to be added. So 3 remains the best answer choice. That might have been easier to just make a list as you went down for the differences and talk about need to add for this, subtract for that, just to keep it straight in your head. Yeah, you can count on brick being superior, even superior to hardy plank, that cement composite kind of board. Brick is superior to that. It might be on par with hard coat stucco, maybe even synthetic stucco. Stone, it'd be comparable to stone as well. But it's going to be superior. All of those would be superior to any kind of siding. Vinyl, masonite, hardy plank. Certainly asbestos, which would be a liability. Okay. Let's take a look at one of these with numbers applied to it. Just kind of sit back, eat your popcorn, and take a look. Gross income is $400,000 per year. Vacancy rate is 5%. Operating expenses are $50,000 per year. Debt service is $75,000 per year. Is there anything in this list so far that we don't need in order to calculate the net operating income? Yeah, that was a good question. Joseph, about the brick. Good job. Yeah, we don't need debt service to figure out the answer about NOI. We would need it to go further and figure out the cash flow, though. And so if we continue on down, we are given the fact, oh, I see break time. Let me read through the rest of this and we'll come back and look at the numbers. The cap rate given is 8%. The original investment, meaning how much did they have to put into it when they bought it? $100,000. When we come back, we'll make some, we'll see what those calculations might be. And I'll see you back here in 10. Welcome back. We left off with this problem. Let's take a look at it. We're going to have our gross income of 400,000 there at the top. Subtract out 20,000 because 5% of 400,000 is 20,000. 5% is our vacancy rate. That gives us our 380 effective income. Now we're going to need to subtract out the operating expenses. Those are 50,000 per year. So there's that one. And that gives us our net operating income of 330. Now we're going to subtract out the debt service loan payments of $75,000 a year. And that gives us our cash flow of 255. If we know that our NOI is 330, okay, good. And we know that our cap rate is 8%, we can just plug those two things in, divide the 330 by the 8%, shows us that the market value is approximately $4.1 million. The more of these you do, the more I think it sort of clicks. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what comes next. So an investor shouldn't pay more than the 4.1 million to get an 8% rate of return. Just a reminder of a few things. Never average the different approaches. Reconcile them with the appropriate approach for the property type. First step of the appraisal is defining the problem. The last step is reconciling the three values to the most similar to the subject property. We, under license law, as brokers, are responsible for providing a written CMA to all clients, both sellers and buyers, by the way. This isn't just a seller activity. Your buyer needs to know what if that listing price is out of the question. It's just a wish price. So I do CMAs for buyers as well as sellers. We need to see if they're crazy and know what they're talking about, they being the seller. We'll know kind of what we have room with to make an offer for. Appraisers give value. Brokers give sales price. But it's all an estimate or an opinion. In both cases, I'm a broker and I might give it a value of 350, but Jason's a broker. He might give it a value of 355. What adjustments is he using versus what I'm using? Quite likely somewhat different based on our knowledge of the area, based on the research we've done. And does he choose to take, what part of the dollars per square foot is he using for the adjustment compared to me? Maybe I see that houses are selling for $200 a square foot in a certain area. I want to use a portion or fragment of that to make my adjustments with, but what portion of it? Am I going to use 50% of that, like $100 a square foot, or is Jason going to use more like 60%, maybe $110, $120 a square foot, based on our individual experience and expertise and knowledge of an area? So guess what? Brokers are not commodities. Brokers are not the same. And it has not much to do with experience or years in. It has to do with work ethic, how many reps you're at. If you've done a ton of research, but you're a 2-year in the business broker, you might have a much better grasp than a 10, 15-year veteran in the business because you've done your homework. You've stayed on top of the stats. By the way, stay on top of the stats. Study the industry so that you can talk in the grocery store line about what these different things mean in any given moment, right? CMA versus BPO, if there's any compensation given for whichever thing we call it, typically it's the BPO that we're being compensated for, but it could also be called a CMA. But test question, are you being paid for it? A PB can't get paid for it. Only a full broker. And even a full broker can't get paid for it if it's for originating a loan or for anything requiring an appraisal. Otherwise, it's the CMA as part of a listing set of duties, part of our fee for representation. So we're including that CMA for free. It's a fiduciary duty, not an extra service like the BPO would be. So true or false, knowing how to do a CMA BPO is not that big a deal. Just look at the market trends. Pretty big deal, isn't it? Okay, let's take a look at something here. Let's do a little shift in the line of topics here. We've mostly finished that chapter. We got a couple more things we'll pick up next week, but let me fire off this Kahoot as a review of 21 closing procedures. So go ahead to kahoot.it and put in that game pin. I think I've asked you this before. Can you hear that Kahoot music? Okay, good. Okay, let's see what we can do. Closing procedures. Which item has a 10% tolerance for differentiation between loan estimate and closing disclosure? Meaning it needs to, if it exceeds 10% different higher between what the lender promised on the loan estimate compared to the closing disclosure, the lender's got to eat it. Is that a WDIR termite inspection? Discount points, an appraisal fee if the lender suggested the appraiser, or the origination fee? I didn't give you probably as much time as you would have liked for really thinking about this one. So there we go. So this is the one where the thing that they have to be dead accurate on, knows no amount of tolerance of difference between loan estimation and final CD amount. If it freezes up on you, you might back out and come back in. I think you can just put in that game pin and join back in. Those things are the hard and fast loan related fees that they have full control over charging you, like origination and discount points. They better be exactly 100% accurate between the loan estimate and the closing disclosure. If they're not, the lender has to absorb that extra overage cost. The wood destroying insect is not none of you fell for that one, so I won't even talk about it. The appraisal fee, if suggested by the lender, that's the one that falls in that 10% tolerance, because it's still lender related, but it's not like their fee. But they're saying, here's the list of appraisers the lender is suggesting. So that's the one that has, if it's more than a 10% difference between what the lender estimates it's going to be and what it actually ends up being, the lender has to absorb that cost. Good job, Joe. The combined settlement procedures process is called what? It's like the monster acronym. Is it TILA? Is it RESPA? Is it TRID? Or is it RESPECT? Find out what it means to me. Good job. 3 of you got it. TRID stands for what? TILA, RESPA, Information Disclosure. We did talk a lot about RESPA, but RESPA combined with TILA. TILA means Truth in Lending Act, meaning the lender's got to tell you what they're charging, tell you the truth about what they're charging you. RESPA, Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, means you got to do these procedures in a certain way. It goes back to that 10% tolerance, zero tolerance thing. It goes back to providing a loan estimate within 3 days of application and the closing disclosure, fast forward within 3 days before closing. By the way, on that closing disclosure given to the borrower 3 days before closing, let's say the clock counts down and now we're the day before closing. And all of a sudden, for some reason, the lender says, no, we told you the rate was going to be 7. It's going to be 7.25. Guess what? We're not closing tomorrow. Now it's going to close 3 days from that. So it's got to be the revised closing disclosure and now a revised 3-day heads up to give the buyer time to look it over. That's a requirement under RESPA. But the thing that combines all of those procedures together is this, I call it the monster acronym, because TRID, T-R-I-D, stands for TILA, RESPA, Information Disclosure. Which of the following is not a scenario for property tax adjustment? When do you not adjust for property taxes? If the closing happens before September 1st or after September 1st and the seller has not paid the bill, or closing happens when the deed and the deed of trust is recorded. Is that part of property tax adjustment? Or closing after September 1st and the seller has paid the entire tax bill? There you go. Yeah. Out of all 4 of these, the 3 that are potential possibilities of how to handle property tax prorations are the red, blue, and the green. But the thing that doesn't relate to property taxes is the closing and the recording of the deed and deed of trust. All those other 3 are some kind of a proration or double debit situation. What are we going to do? How are we going to handle the taxes if closing happens before September 1st? Debits and credits. How's that going to look? out of those three proration possibilities, how's that going to look? So if it's before September 1st, does it matter? Or let me ask it this way. If it's before September 1st, have the taxes been paid yet? Can they be paid yet? No, they can't. So there's no option. So the taxes definitely cannot be paid. Therefore, what do we have here? Here's September 1st. Here's our closing date. We're just going to prorate and see what the seller's amount is and debit the sellers their portion. And we just need to give that over to the buyer's side, the buyer's column, so that when September 1st does come around, they have the money they need to add to their portion of the year responsibility and send in the payment. So it's going to be a debit seller, the seller's portion, and a credit the buyer, that same amount. So that's one possibility. The other was after September 1st, and the taxes have been paid. How do we handle taxes on the settlement statement that way? They've been paid for the whole year. Here's our September 1st. The seller is paid up for the whole year. They don't like the buyer that much. They're going to expect a chunk of money back. This chunk, the buyer's portion, is the adjustment we need to make. And so we're going to credit the seller and debit the buyer what amount? The buyer's portion. It's another proration. And then the third one is not a proration. It's closing after September 1st, and taxes have not been paid. And what's happening there is they've not been paid at all, so the seller needs to pay their part and the buyer needs to pay their part. So it's going to be a debit to the seller and a debit to the buyer for their own individual amounts. Good? How do you calculate the 1% origination fee? Is it 1% of down payment, 1% of price, one depends on what the real estate commission says, or 1% of the loan amount? If it's a loan fee, which it is, it's about the loan amount, not the sale price. Origination fee, discount points, they're all about the loan amount. Most of you got that. Good job. Deed preparation is counted as what on the closing disclosure? Is deed preparation handled as a debit to seller, debit to buyer, debit to seller, 1% of the loan amount, or it depends on how many days the seller owned it that year? The cost of preparing the deed, by the way, cost about $400 or $500, maybe $300. It's the thing the attorney's doing. He's creating the deed based on what the contract says, and the seller pays for deed prep. The deed is not a proration. It's not a double debit. So debit buyer, debit seller, no. Buyer's not paying for it. The seller's paying for it. It's one of the few things the seller's paying for. What are some other things the seller pays for? Deed prep. Oh yeah, that commission, the most important thing. What else? What are other seller expenses? Debits to seller. Maybe repairs. Okay. There we go. Yeah. Excise tax. It's another seller potential. Obviously, however the taxes might be handled, just depends. 2 out of the 3 would be a seller debit possibilities. 2 out of 3 possibilities of when we close. Closing attorney, really the only closing attorney fee for the seller to pay is just going to be the deed preparation. The bulk of the attorney fees are paid by the buyer, especially for this class for your purposes. But something else would be the recording fee. Or no, it's going to be the overnight fee, which relates to the final one that I'm thinking of. What's that overnight fee for? What are you overnighting? What's that attorney sending that they charge this $50 fee for? Probably one of the biggest potential fees that the seller has to pay. It's just a debit to seller, has nothing to do with the buyer. There it is. The loan payoff of their existing mortgage. There might be a couple more here and there depending on repairs that were negotiated, but these are the top 6 that we tend to see. Broker is responsible for verifying the calculations but doesn't need to attend the closing. True or false? As long as we verify the calculations, we don't have to show up. Is that true or false? False. We are responsible for verifying calculations, and we are responsible for going to the closing. The commission's going to say, you better show up at that closing. Don't you be lazy. Don't you move on to the next deal. You've got to be there. And hopefully nothing will happen and you'll be bored, because excitement is bad for closings. We don't want excitement. We want boredom. I've saved the day a couple of times because we didn't have to like go away and come back, or closing fell through because of me. I had access to some document somebody needed, and I was sitting there and I pulled it up with my phone and forwarded it to the paralegal, and 5 minutes later they printed it and brought it in there for people to sign. Show up. The commission says so. When is property tax considered past due? January 1st, September 1st, December 31st, 3 business days after closing. There you go. We have until December 31st to pay it. If we pay it on December 31st, it's okay. We're not past due. That's just the last possible day. But January 1st will be past due. So you can pay it from September 1st when the bill comes out all the way up to and including December 31st. RESPA acronym stands for what? Real Estate Salespeople Association. Real estate sellers provide assets. Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, or Real Estate Settlement Provisions Account. Good job. Settlement Procedures Act is what we do to follow properly the procedures of closing. When is a HUD-1 used instead of a closing disclosure? FHA related, cash purchase, VA, or conventional? HUD-1 is just another type of settlement statement, like a closing disclosure, except it's for a certain situation. HUD-1 is something we use when it's a cash purchase. If it's an FHA loan or a VA or a conventional, any kind of loan, RESPA requires that they use a closing disclosure, right? Because the closing disclosure is sort of the partner to the loan estimate. Those are both very formatted and similarly set up and formatted documents so that lenders can't hide fees in the fine print. They've got to acknowledge fees. In certain places on both the loan estimate and the closing disclosure, they look very similar. So anything about a loan is going to require that. But the another kind of settlement statement is the HUD-1 form. And that's what we would use when it's cash. We're not required to use the closing disclosure for a cash purchase because it's not a loan. There's no loan being used. So cash is what the HUD-1 is used for. Real estate commission is handled how on the CD? Closing disclosure charges the real estate commission to who? Debit seller credit buyer, credit to seller if paid by September 1st, or not enough for all the work the broker did. Good job. I was hoping for some greens because that is true also. But it's a debit to the seller. The seller's paying that commission. It's not a proration. Typically, seller pays for all of it. When's that loan estimate required to be given to the borrower by the lender? Lender has to give it to the borrower, what, third day after first substantial contact, or by September 1st, or immediately but by the third business day after the application for the loan, or 3 days before closing. The LE, loan estimate. You got it. Good job. 3 days after that application for the loan has gone through. This is the thing you do in the beginning. The lender's doing this up front. It's an estimate. We don't know what the costs are finally until the end. And the thing that happens at the end is the closing disclosure. That's the thing that has to be given 3 days before closing to the borrower. But the loan estimate is up front. How is property tax handled when closing happens after September 1st and the seller has not paid? Figured if I read all that stuff to you, it would just be confusing. But this one is, and you might have drawn it out. On the test, I would draw it out every time just to keep it straight. And so if you drew out the whole year, you would say, well, here's January, here's December, here's our September. If it's closing sometime back in here, but they haven't been paid yet, the seller's responsible for the whole year from January 1 to the closing day. The buyer's responsible for that tiny little piece, but we're going to debit them each separate amounts of their own piece of the pie. So which one is that? It's the yellow one. Debit the seller January 1st to closing day. Debit the buyer the remainder of the year. Let's see the red one. If we debited the seller and credited the buyer, then that would be if we were closing when in the year. Which part of the year are we closing if we debit the seller and give that money to the buyer? Yeah. It's going to be before the bill comes out, before September 1st. We're taking money from the seller for the amount of time that they lived there, owned it, giving it to the buyer's side. The buyer will pay the whole bill whenever it's due, and now they have the seller's piece to do it with. Debiting the buyer and crediting the seller would be which scenario? We're taking money from the buyer and giving it to the seller because the seller has paid the whole year's taxes. That means the taxes are payable, which means closing must be after September 1st and paid for the whole year. We got to give the seller back some money. So take your time on the test, write them out, maybe as soon as you get there. Pull out your scratch paper, write that and any other sort of shaky information you're having trouble keeping track of so that you're ready. How's property tax handled when closing happens before September 1st? It's funny to me that the music changed to this notably scary sounding on these problems. Closing before September 1st, we are gonna here's our September. We're closing right here. We need to account for this much time for the seller, debit that amount, credit it to the buyer in the amount of the seller's part. So which answer choice is that? Debit seller, credit buyer for January 1st through closing day. Yellow would be if the closing is September 1st or after and the taxes have not yet been paid. It's customary in North Carolina for the buyer and seller to have their own separate attorneys. True or false? That's right. False. Who hires the attorney? Typically. And therefore, who is the attorney representing? Buyer and lender. The buyer gets to pay for it. But the attorney does a little bit of work for the seller. If the seller wanted their own attorney to do the deed preparation, they could do that. And that attorney would bill the other attorney. But that doesn't have to happen. It's customary for one attorney to be involved, chosen by the buyer. How is interim interest counted on the closing disclosure? Interim interest is a buyer side only. There's nothing to do with the seller because it's about the buyer's new loan. Interim interest is about the buyer's new loan. It's not a proration, it's just a buyer expense, buyer debit. All of the following can be prorated except what? What could possibly not be prorated out of all this? Good job. That first year insurance premium, that's paid by who? Buyer pays it. Good job. All of the following steps are needed to determine prorated taxes between buyer and seller. I guess I'm not sure what the point of this one is. Determine number of days from January 1st to closing, amount of taxes per day, how much is credited, debited, how much in taxes is owed from the previous year. So I need to put in the word except. All the following steps are needed to determine taxes except which one. Sorry about that. The previous year's taxes are irrelevant. So that's the right answer. We don't have to worry about last year's taxes. We're just dealing in this year's taxes. So all those other answer choices are what's involved in determining taxes for this year's closing. How many line items for homeowners insurance could there be on a closing disclosure? Are we handling insurance in one spot or two, or one for the premium, or only one for the 2 years escrow setup, or two for that'd be a premium and something for setting up the escrow, or does it just depend on the title insurance? That was a little confusing. It's going to show up in two places. The attorney is directed by the lender. The typical procedure is charge the buyer for the entire first year's insurance premium. But then what about next year? The lender tells the attorney, go ahead and collect a certain number of months to establish the escrow account. So that next year and beyond, all the other years, that account has plenty of money in it with a bit of a cushion to pay that bill when it comes due. But the whole first year will be handled at closing upfront. So that's going to be two insurance-related line items on the closing disclosure. Title search is counted as what on the closing disclosure? Who's paying? Good job. Buyer's paying for that title search. Make sure that there's no clouds on the title. How's property tax handled when closing happens after September 1st and the seller has paid the whole year? I think I might have put the wrong answer here. Let's see. For closing after September 1st, seller has paid the whole year. We need to give the seller back some money. We're going to credit the seller and debit the buyer. Yeah, no, that's right. So green is right. We're crediting the seller for the amount of money equivalent to the day after closing through December 31st. Well, they've already paid that. They already paid for the whole year, right? So you don't have to credit them for that. Here's the situation. We are closing after September 1st, like right in there. Seller has paid the whole year's worth, including their portion. But the thing is, they've also paid the buyer's portion. So we need, yeah, that's why I like this little timeline that I keep using. The buyer's piece, we need to get back to them. Good question. Sales price is counted as what on the closing disclosure? Good job. Debit to buyer, that's sales price. How else will it be counted? There's another place it'll show up on the closing disclosure that I didn't give you an answer choice for. Sales price is a debit to the buyer, but what is it to the seller? Yeah, credit to the seller. And by having it as a debit to buyer and credit to seller, and then also having the loan amount that the buyer's borrowing, that factors in the down payment, right? So there is no down payment item because sale price minus loan amount is the down payment. Which item has zero tolerance for the difference between the loan estimate and the closing disclosure? Meaning it better be accurate, or the lender pays the overage. Origination fee is in the full control of the lender. The appraisal fee is something the lender's requiring, but the lender's not doing the appraisal. So therefore the lender is not in charge of how much the appraisal costs. It's whatever the appraiser charges. But that appraisal fee would be under the 10% bucket. It'd be in that column. So if the lender gave an estimate of how much the appraisal might cost and it exceeds 10% more than their estimate, the lender's got to absorb that cost. But in the zero tolerance bucket of fees, it's the stuff that they charge. Like for you, let's say as a broker, you chose to do the whole limited service a la carte model, and you choose to charge $1,000 for putting it in the MLS, and $500 more for the marketing photos, professional photos, and $300 more for drone shots, and $400 for Facebook ads, like running paid ads on Facebook and Instagram. Those are all well within your control and choice of what to charge. So that's what we're talking about with this zero tolerance for the lender. What do they choose to charge for origination? They could choose to charge anything for it. So they therefore can't make it higher. Or if they did make it higher on the closing disclosure, they would have to pay the amount over what they promised you that they were going to charge you for the origination fee. When do property tax bills come out? Good job. September 1st is when that bill is out, able to be paid, but not necessarily paid then. Not closing day. Closing day is when the attorney is going to handle whichever way the taxes will be dealt with, credits, debits, that sort of thing. But the bill comes out September 1st. And then finally, how's the seller's payoff counted on the closing disclosure? Seller's payoff is a problem of the seller only, right? And they're paying off what? They're paying off their existing mortgage. So they got to pay their mortgage, so it's a debit to the seller. Not a credit to the seller, because they got to pay that loan off from their sales proceeds. Good job. Let's see how we did. Sheena, well done. $200 for Sheena. Kirsty has $400, and because it's tonight, special occasion, Corey gets $1,000 from his neighbor. Let us know how that goes. Good job. Good luck with that. Okay, well done. So, to recap in this last minute and a half, your syllabus is your friend. Get real snuggly with that syllabus. Go down through it. Now that we've covered this stuff in 17, valuation, read through the syllabus, try to answer the questions and remember what you can about it. Ask me questions based on having reviewed this syllabus. And next on the list, we'll start next week with property insurance. If you'll notice, let's see. Need to name these things better so they stand out more. We've got a bunch of little baby chapters. Got a couple of 2-hour chapters. Oh, I know where I can find it. Here we go. Oh, yeah. I was going to mention that. Yeah, good question. That's built in to our time together. And if we look down here at the study guide, we've got insurance basics. So that's 1.25 plus 2.25. That's 3.5, 4. So we should get through about insurance, landlord, tenant, and property management on Wednesday. Then on Thursday, we'll pretty much knock out the rest of the stuff. And what does that put us at? Next Wednesday, next Thursday. And then that gives us the 30th for review and the test on the 31st. But notice we've done review along the way. Like tonight, we just spent a half hour reviewing closing stuff. So we will probably get done sooner than these chapters. And so we'll be able to do some review starting this next week on Thursday, as well as the following Wednesday. So, yep, we've got that in there. And we've pretty much covered the license law and commission rules as well. We'll re-hit those. Saturday. So reminder, use your Zoom link if you can join us this coming Saturday in 2 days, 11 to 12 or 1, whatever we need to do. So basically 11 to 1-ish. Math. Whatever math problems you're struggling with, let me know. And we'll talk about it. And whatever else we want to fit in after we've done some math. So happy to have you. I will be recording it and including it. So if you can't join us for all of it or any of it, it'll be there. Don't forget the YouTube channels. We've got some walkthrough narrated math problems there too. I owe you a couple of closing disclosure monster questions that I just realized yesterday. So I'm going to finish that out and get that to you as well. So you can kind of get some familiarity with what the buyer needs to bring and what the seller is going to get, seller proceeds. So I haven't forgotten about that. Besides that, have a great weekend. Let me know your thoughts, questions, any way you need to. Text or email is fine. And I'll see you next week.